Hello and welcome. I know many of you use these videos to help you fall asleep. So before we begin, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also comment where you're from and at what time you're watching. Take a moment to get comfortable, relax, and let yourself unwind. The mall was packed, filled with the murmur of voices, the hum of escalators, and the scent of food drifting from the court. Lisa held her son's hand tightly, weaving through the crowd. Ethan was only 6, small and quick, and she never liked taking her eyes off him for too long. She had promised him a trip to the toy store after lunch, and he was practically bouncing with excitement. Ethan said, "Mom, can I pick a car? A big one." Lisa said, "We'll see, if it's not too expensive." Ethan said, "A really fast one. Red like a fire truck." Lisa said, "All right, but stay close to me." She glanced down to make sure he was still holding her hand. He was. His tiny fingers curled around hers, warm and familiar. They walked past a row of clothing stores, the bright window displays flashing by in a blur. Then, for just a moment, she let go. She needed to pull her phone from her purse, just for a second, to check a message, to reply quickly. When she looked back down, her hand was empty. Ethan was gone. Her heart stopped. The crowd surged around her, people moving in every direction, their faces blurring together. She spun in place, scanning the sea of shoppers. Lisa said, "Ethan? Ethan?" Her voice was swallowed by the noise, her panic rising. She pushed through the crowd, her breath coming fast and sharp. He had been right beside her, only seconds ago. Her eyes darted from store to store. He wasn't in the toy store entrance. He wasn't by the benches. She turned a full circle, her chest tightening. Then she saw him. Just a few feet ahead, Ethan stood near the entrance of a shoe store, holding someone's hand. For a split second, relief washed over her. She rushed toward him, calling his name. Then she saw who was holding him. It was her. Lisa froze. The woman standing beside Ethan was herself. Same height, same brown hair pulled into a loose ponytail, same dark jeans and green sweater. The same face. Lisa felt the air leave her lungs. The woman turned to look at her, and Lisa saw the same wide eyes, the same slightly parted lips, her own face staring back at her. Ethan turned too, his little face bright with a smile. Ethan said, "Mom, look, I found you." Lisa couldn't move. Her legs felt like stone. She saw the woman's hand wrapped around Ethan's, fingers pressing lightly against his small wrist. It was her hand, her own hand. Lisa said, "Ethan, come here, sweetheart." Her voice trembled. She stretched her arms toward him. The other Lisa smiled. It was an empty smile, like a reflection in a glass. Other Lisa said, "He's fine. He was looking for his mom, and I found him." Lisa's skin crawled. The voice was hers. The same tone, the same soft inflection. She took a slow step forward. Lisa said, "Let go of my son." The other Lisa tilted her head, considering her. Other Lisa said, "But I am his mom." Lisa's breath hitched. Ethan hesitated, his tiny brow furrowing as he looked from one woman to the other. His grip on the other Lisa's hand tightened. Ethan said, "Mom." Lisa's stomach twisted. Lisa said, "Baby, it's me. Let go of her hand and come to me." The other Lisa's smile widened. Other Lisa said, "Ethan, sweetheart, come on. We should go now." She turned, gently pulling him along. Panic exploded in Lisa's chest. Lisa screamed, "Ethan and oh!" She lunged forward, grabbing for his arm. But the moment her fingers touched him, the entire mall shifted. The lights above flickered, and for a split second, the crowd around her vanished. The stores, the signs, the people, all gone. She stood in a vast, empty space, the floor stretching endlessly in every direction, a dim, gray nothingness pressing in from all sides. The only thing left was Ethan, the other Lisa, and the echoing silence. Then the crowd snapped back into place, the mall returning in a blink. The noise, the voices, the movement, all normal again. But something was wrong. Ethan was staring at her, his lips trembling. Ethan whispered, "Mom, what happened?" Lisa grabbed him, pulling him close, her arms wrapped protectively around him. She looked up, but the other Lisa was gone. Only the fading echo of her voice remained. Other Lisa whispered, "I'll come back for him." Lisa's blood ran cold. Lisa clutched Ethan tightly, her breath ragged. The mall hummed around her as if nothing had happened, people moving past without a second glance. But her world had shifted. She pulled away just enough to cup Ethan's face, scanning him. His brown eyes were wide, confused. He was real, warm, solid, safe in her arms. Lisa said, "Baby, are you okay? Did she say anything to you?" Ethan hesitated, his small fingers twisted in the fabric of her sweater. Ethan said, "She found me when I got lost. She said she was my mom." Lisa's heart clenched. Lisa said, "No, sweetheart, that wasn't me. If you ever see her again, you run. You scream for me, okay?" Ethan nodded, but his expression was troubled. Ethan said, "But Mom, she knew my name, and she looked just like you." Lisa swallowed hard. She needed to get out of here. She needed to get Ethan somewhere safe. She scooped him up, holding him close as she hurried toward the parking lot. Every face in the crowd felt like a threat. Every reflective surface, store windows, mirrors, the gleaming tile floor, felt like a doorway to something watching her. She reached the car, fumbling with the keys, her hands shaking. She strapped Ethan into his seat, glancing around, half expecting to see the other Lisa standing somewhere nearby, smiling that empty smile. She drove home in silence, her mind racing. What was that woman? When they reached their apartment, she locked the door behind them, sliding the deadbolt into place. The familiar space should have brought comfort. The small couch with Ethan's stuffed animals scattered across it, the smell of his crayons and her vanilla-scented candles. But something was wrong. She glanced at the hallway mirror near the entrance, and froze. Her reflection stood there, just as it should. But it wasn't right. Her breathing was too slow. Her hands hung just a little too still at her sides. And her eyes weren't following her movements. Lisa's chest tightened. She lifted her hand. The reflection lifted its hand a second too late. A tremor ran through her body. She reached for the mirror, fingertips just an inch away from the glass. Ethan said, "Mom." Lisa jumped, whirling around. Ethan stood behind her, hugging his stuffed rabbit. Lisa said, "Baby, go to your room, okay?" Ethan said, "But..." Lisa said, "Now, Ethan." He hesitated, then nodded, shuffling toward his room. Lisa turned back to the mirror. Her reflection was smiling. She wasn't. She stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. The reflection's lips moved, but no sound came out. Then, in a whisper so faint it barely existed, she heard it. Reflection, Lisa whispered, "I told you. I'll come back for him." The lights flickered, and the reflection was gone. "To be continued. You said. Continue with the next part." ChatGPT said. Lisa's breath came in quick, shallow gasps. The mirror reflected nothing unusual now, just her wide, terrified eyes, her pale face. But she knew what she had seen. She turned away, gripping the edge of the hallway table for support. Her hands trembled. She needed to think, needed to stay calm. "Ethan." She rushed to his room, pushing open the door. He sat on his bed, clutching his stuffed rabbit, watching her with worried eyes. Ethan said, "Mom, what's wrong?" Lisa forced a smile, though her face felt stiff, unnatural. Lisa said, "Nothing, baby. Just a little tired. Do you want me to stay with you while you sleep?" Ethan nodded. She crawled into bed beside him, wrapping her arms around his small frame. He was warm, his breath steady. She closed her eyes, listening to the sound of his heartbeat. But sleep never came. Lisa lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind a whirlpool of fear. That woman, that thing, it wasn't human, and it wanted her son. At some point, exhaustion overtook her, pulling her into restless sleep. She woke to soft whispers. Her heart pounded as she turned her head. Ethan was still asleep, his face peaceful. But the whispers, they were coming from the hallway. Slow, muffled, like someone was speaking through glass. Lisa slid out of bed, careful not to wake Ethan. Her feet were silent against the wooden floor as she stepped into the hallway. The mirror. Her stomach twisted. The reflection was back. This time, it wasn't just her. A second figure stood beside her reflection. A small figure. Ethan. Lisa's blood ran cold. Her reflection was holding his hand. Her reflection smiled. Reflection, Lisa whispered. It's almost time. Lisa lunged forward, slamming her hand against the glass. The mirror didn't shatter. It didn't even shake. But the reflection did. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt. The air grew heavy, thick, as if something was pressing down on her. The lights flickered. The hallway felt wrong. Stretched. Warped. Then, everything snapped back to normal. The reflection was gone. Lisa staggered back, gasping. She turned, rushing back to Ethan's room, her pulse hammering in her ears. He was still there. Still sleeping. Still safe. But for how long? She couldn't stay here. She had to leave. Lisa grabbed a duffel bag from the closet, stuffing clothes inside as quickly as she could. She'd take Ethan and go, anywhere. A hotel. A friend's house. As far away as possible. She yanked open the drawer where she kept her keys. And froze. Her keys were gone. A chill slithered down her spine. Then from the hallway a voice. Her own voice. Reflection, Lisa whispered. You can't run from yourself. The lights went out. Darkness swallowed the room. Lisa's breath hitched as she reached blindly for the nightstand, fingers fumbling for her phone. The air felt thick, pressing against her skin like an unseen weight. A soft creak came from the hallway. Lisa stiffened. That wasn't Ethan. The sound was slow, deliberate. Footsteps. Her fingers finally closed around her phone. She turned on the flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness. The hallway beyond Ethan's door was empty, but the mirror. Lisa's stomach twisted. Her reflection was still there, standing in the dim glow of the phone light. But something was wrong. The glass seemed deeper now, stretching back into a vast, empty space. Lisa took a slow step forward. Lisa said, "Leave us alone." The reflection blinked. Then, slowly, its lips curled into a smile. Reflection, Lisa whispered, "I just want what's mine." Lisa clenched her jaw, gripping the doorframe. Lisa said, "He is not yours." The reflection tilted its head. Reflection, Lisa whispered, "Are you sure?" Lisa's breath caught in her throat. The reflection stepped aside. Behind it, in that dark, endless space, stood Ethan. But it wasn't her Ethan. The child in the mirror looked like him. Same tousled hair, same small frame. But his face was pale, almost colorless. His eyes were dull, lifeless. And his tiny hand was wrapped around the reflection's fingers. Lisa shook her head, stepping back. Lisa said, "No, that's not real. You're lying." The reflection chuckled, a low, eerie sound that barely made a noise but filled the silence like a distant echo. Reflection, Lisa whispered, "Then why is he so cold when you hold him?" A sick feeling twisted in Lisa's gut. She turned sharply, running back into Ethan's room. He was still in bed. She touched his face. His skin was warm. His chest rose and fell in steady breaths. He was here. He was real. Lisa exhaled shakily, gripping his tiny shoulders. Lisa whispered, "Ethan, baby, wake up. We need to go." Ethan stirred, rubbing his eyes. Ethan mumbled, "What's wrong, Mom?" Lisa swallowed, forcing a smile. Lisa said, "We're going on a little trip, okay?" Ethan nodded sleepily, but as Lisa pulled him up, he suddenly tensed. Ethan whispered, "Mom, there's someone behind you." Lisa's blood turned to ice. She didn't turn around. Couldn't. A breath, warm, too close, ghosted against the back of her neck. Then a voice. Soft. Familiar. Reflection. Lisa whispered, "You have the wrong one." The lights flickered back on. Lisa spun around. The room was empty. The mirror in the hallway was shattered. Shards of glass littered the hallway floor, glinting under the dim light. Lisa's heart pounded as she clutched Ethan tightly against her chest. The mirror was gone. The reflection was gone. But she could still feel it, something lingering in the air, watching. Ethan trembled in her arms. Ethan whispered, "Mom, I don't like this." Lisa said, "I know, baby. We're leaving right now." She grabbed his coat, threw on her own, and rushed to the front door. Her hands fumbled with the lock. It wouldn't turn. Lisa's breath hitched. She tried again, twisting the knob harder. It wouldn't budge. Lisa whispered, "No, no, no." She turned to the windows. Maybe she could break one, climb out. But the windows were gone. The walls stretched smooth where the glass should have been. No frames. No curtains. Just blank, lifeless walls. Lisa's stomach dropped. Lisa whispered, "This isn't real." A quiet giggle echoed from behind her. She turned sharply. Ethan was standing a few feet away now, staring at her. But something was wrong. His face was blank, expressionless. His hands hung limply at his sides. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. Lisa said, "Ethan?" The boy tilted his head. Boy whispered, "Are you sure it's me?" A cold rush of terror flooded Lisa's veins. She lunged forward, grabbing his wrist. His skin was ice cold. No, this wasn't Ethan. She turned wildly, scanning the room, searching. A sound. A muffled, distant pounding. It was coming from inside the house. Lisa's pulse roared in her ears. She followed the sound, her hands trembling as she pressed her ear against the hallway closet door. Thump, thump, thump. Soft, weak, like something trapped inside. Lisa's fingers hovered over the handle. Then, a whisper. Ethan's voice. Small, fragile. "Mommy, I'm in here." Lisa's breath hitched. She turned slowly. The boy standing behind her hadn't moved. But now he was smiling. Lisa's hands shook as she reached for the closet door. Her mind screamed at her to stop, to think, to run, but she couldn't leave Ethan. If that was really him inside. Behind her, the other Ethan stood motionless, his eerie smile widening. Boy whispered, "What if you open the wrong door?" Lisa swallowed hard. Lisa whispered, "Ethan, baby, is that really you?" A weak knock from inside. Ethan's voice muffled. "Mommy, please, it's dark in here." Lisa's breath came in short gasps. She had no choice. She grabbed the handle and yanked the door open. A small figure tumbled forward into her arms. It was Ethan. His skin was warm. His tiny hands gripped her desperately. His face was buried against her shoulder, his body trembling. Ethan sobbed, "Mommy, I couldn't get out. I couldn't get out." Lisa clutched him tightly, tears burning in her eyes. Lisa whispered, "It's okay, baby. I've got you." Then, a sharp, cold laugh. Lisa turned. The other Ethan was still standing there, unmoving. But now his head was tilted too far, his smile stretching impossibly wide. The boy whispered, "Wrong choice." Lisa's heart lurched. The lights flickered violently. Shadows slithered along the walls, stretching toward her. The air turned thick, suffocating. Ethan clung to her, sobbing. Ethan whimpered, "Mommy, don't let him take me." Lisa grabbed him and ran. The shadows lunged. She stumbled down the hallway, gripping Ethan as the walls seemed to close in, warping, twisting. The front door. She had to get to the front door. She reached for it, and suddenly the world shifted. The door vanished. Everything went black. For a long, breathless moment, there was nothing. Just silence. Just the void. Then a whisper, right in her ear. The voice of her own reflection. "You were never supposed to find him." Darkness swallowed Lisa whole. The air was thick and unmoving, pressing against her skin like unseen hands. She held Ethan tightly, his small body trembling in her arms. Lisa whispered, "Ethan, hold on to me, okay? Don't let go." Ethan whimpered, "Mommy, I'm scared." She turned, feeling the space around her, trying to make sense of where they were. The walls, the floor, everything had disappeared. There was no direction, no light, only the deep, endless black. Then a flicker. Far ahead, a dim glow pulsed in the void. Lisa's breath hitched. It was weak, flickering like a dying candle, but it was something. She started moving toward it, one careful step at a time. The silence pressed in on her ears, making her own heartbeat sound deafening. Then, a soft shuffle behind her. Lisa froze. She turned her head, just slightly. Ethan whimpered, "Mommy, someone's there." Her grip on him tightened. Lisa whispered, "Don't look. Keep your eyes on me." Another step. Another shuffle. Closer this time. Lisa fought the urge to run. If she ran, it would chase them. She knew it. Her feet touched something solid. The floor was back. The air felt heavier, thick with something unseen. The light ahead grew stronger, revealing a shape, a doorway. A way out. Lisa moved faster, pulling Ethan along, desperate to reach it. Then behind her, a voice. Not Ethan's voice. Not hers. Identical to hers. "You're going the wrong way." Lisa's blood turned to ice. She didn't look back. She ran. Ethan cried out as she dragged him forward, sprinting toward the glowing doorway. The darkness behind them shifted, moving, closing in. The doorway pulsed. Just a little further. Just a little more. Then, a hand clamped around her wrist. Ice cold. Familiar. Her own hand. Lisa screamed. Lisa thrashed, trying to yank her wrist free. The grip was impossibly strong, ice-cold fingers digging into her skin like iron clamps. She turned, and her stomach dropped. It was her own face staring back at her, twisted in an unnatural grin. The figure's eyes were hollow, empty pits of darkness that seemed to stretch forever. Lisa gasped. No, this isn't real." The reflection tilted its head. The voice, identical to hers, whispered, "But it is, and you're running the wrong way." Ethan whimpered, clinging to Lisa's waist. Ethan sobbed, "Mommy, please, don't listen to her." Lisa's breath came in frantic bursts. The door was just ahead, so close. She jerked her wrist, trying to break free, but her reflection yanked back. Lisa's voice hissed, "You don't belong there anymore. Let go." Lisa gritted her teeth. Lisa growled, "You let go." Summoning every ounce of strength, she twisted her arm and shoved the figure back. For a split second, it released her. That was all she needed. Lisa grabbed Ethan, sprinting toward the doorway. The light pulsed brighter, the air around it humming with energy. Behind her, the thing let out a guttural scream, inhuman, distorted, furious. The darkness lunged. Lisa threw herself forward, and everything shifted. Blinding white light swallowed them whole. The weight of the void vanished. The air was different, warmer, real. Then, the sound of people, muffled voices, footsteps. Lisa blinked, vision adjusting. She was standing in the middle of the mall. Bright lights, shoppers walking by, the hum of conversation, the smell of coffee from a nearby cafe. Like nothing had ever happened. Her heart slammed against her ribs. "Ethan!" She looked down. He was still in her arms. Warm. Real. Safe. Lisa whispered, "Ethan?" Ethan whimpered, "Mommy, is it over?" Tears burned her eyes. She hugged him tighter, pressing her lips against his hair. Lisa whispered, "I don't know, baby. I don't know." She turned and froze. A mirrored column stood near the escalator, reflecting the busy mall. And in that reflection, she saw herself, standing still, not moving, not smiling, just watching, waiting. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. The reflection wasn't right. Everyone else in the mall moved naturally, Shoppers walked, children laughed, a barista poured coffee behind the counter. But she, her reflection, stood motionless, unblinking, expressionless, watching. A chill crawled down Lisa's spine. She clutched Ethan tighter, inching backward. Lisa whispered, This isn't right." Then the reflection smiled. Not a normal smile. A slow, deliberate curl of the lips, stretching too wide, too knowing. Ethan whimpered. Ethan mumbled, "Mommy, she's still here." Lisa grabbed his hand and turned away. They needed to leave. Now. She forced her feet to move, heading for the exit. The mall was loud, too loud. Shoes clicking against tile, cash registers beeping, conversations blending into an overwhelming hum. But Lisa barely heard any of it. Her focus was on the glass storefronts as she passed. Every single one reflected her. And in every single one, she wasn't walking. Her real self moved forward, but the reflection stood still, head slightly tilted, eyes locked onto her like hunters waiting for the perfect moment. Lisa's hands grew clammy. This isn't happening. She reached the sliding glass doors. They whooshed open, letting in the cool evening air. She stepped outside, gulping down the fresh air, but the unease didn't fade. She needed to get to the car, needed to go home. She reached the parking lot, scanning for her car. And then, a hand grabbed her shoulder. Cold, familiar. Lisa's stomach flipped as she spun around, and came face to face with herself. No reflection, no glass, just her, standing in the flesh. Same face, same eyes, same body. But this version of her was still, too still, the expression empty, unreadable. Then the doppelganger spoke, with Lisa's own voice. "You took something that wasn't yours." Lisa's throat tightened. Lisa whispered, "What are you?" The other Lisa didn't blink. "You don't belong here anymore." A sickening chill spread through Lisa's body. She tightened her grip on Ethan's hand. Lisa hissed, "You're lying." The copy tilted its head. Then it slowly raised its hand and pointed at Ethan. Lisa's stomach dropped. The thing smiled again, a slow, eerie stretch of the lips. "Are you sure you brought the right one back?" Lisa's vision blurred. Her breath hitched, and Ethan's tiny fingers squeezed hers. But suddenly she wasn't sure. Was it really him? Lisa's chest tightened. The world around her felt wrong, warped, shifting. The parking lot, the glowing mall signs, the people walking by. It was all too normal, too unchanged, while everything inside her screamed that something was terribly, terribly off. She looked down at Ethan, his wide, scared eyes locked onto hers. His small fingers clutched her hand so tightly it hurt. He was trembling. It had to be him. It had to be. Lisa whispered, "Baby, it's you, right?" Ethan blinked up at her. He opened his mouth, then hesitated. Something in Lisa's stomach twisted. The other Lisa was still standing there, watching, smiling. She murmured, "You should check." Lisa shook her head violently. Lisa snapped, "I'm not playing your game." She yanked Ethan close, stepping backward. But the other Lisa moved with her. Effortless, unnatural, as if the space between them wasn't real. The copy leaned in, her face inches from Lisa's. Her breath smelled like nothing. "Are you sure?" she whispered. Lisa's pulse thundered in her ears. She knelt in front of Ethan, cupping his face with both hands. She stared into his eyes, his big brown eyes, the same ones she kissed goodnight, the same ones that sparkled when he laughed. But were they? A horrible, horrible thought slithered into her mind. Had she really looked at him when they got back? Had she truly checked? Or had she been so relieved to escape that she assumed it was him? She forced herself to swallow the rising panic. Lisa whispered, "Say something, baby. Anything." Ethan bit his lip. His little hands trembled as he reached up and touched her cheek. His voice was small. "Mommy, it's me. I promise." Relief slammed into Lisa so hard she almost collapsed. She wrapped her arms around him, clutching him like a lifeline. Lisa choked out, I know, baby. I know. She turned back to the copy, rage surging through her veins. Lisa growled, "You can't have him." The other Lisa's smile never faltered. "We'll see," she whispered. Then, she stepped backward, and as she did, the night seemed to swallow her whole. Her skin darkened, dissolving into the shadows. Her features melted into the void. And then, she was gone. Lisa stood there, breathless, staring at the empty space where the figure had just been. The air felt lighter, like something unnatural had just left. But even as she turned toward the car, even as she held Ethan close and whispered comforting words, she couldn't shake the feeling. It wasn't over, and deep down, somewhere in the darkest part of her mind, a question still lingered, a question she would never dare ask. Was she sure? Lisa drove home in silence. Ethan sat in the back seat, staring out the window, his little hands folded neatly in his lap. He wasn't speaking. He wasn't crying. He was just watching. Lisa's grip on the steering wheel was tight. Her knuckles had gone white. The air in the car felt suffocating. Her mind kept replaying the moment in the parking lot. That thing, that copy, the way it had spoken to her, the way it had smiled, and the worst part, the question it had left behind. "Are you sure you brought the right one back?" Lisa's throat felt dry. She flicked her eyes to the rearview mirror, stealing a glance at Ethan. He looked like her son, but something felt different. "Snap out of it," she scolded herself. "You're shaken up. That's all. He's fine. You're fine." She pulled into the driveway, cutting the engine. Lisa turned. "We're home, baby." Ethan didn't move at first. He just kept staring out the window. Then slowly he turned toward her. A small, hesitant smile tugged at his lips. "Okay, Mommy," he said softly. Lisa let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She climbed out, walked around, and unbuckled him from his car seat. His tiny arms wrapped around her neck as she lifted him, and she held him close. He smelled the same. He felt the same. Maybe she had been imagining things. She carried him inside, locking the door behind them. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that made Lisa's skin crawl. She set Ethan down, forcing a smile. Lisa said, "How about some warm milk before bed?" Ethan nodded, but he was still watching her. Lisa turned away, walking into the kitchen. She grabbed a small pot, poured in the milk, and set it on the stove. Then she froze. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. There was a mirror on the fridge, a small decorative one, and in its reflection, Ethan was still staring at her. But his expression, it wasn't the same. His lips weren't curved in a soft smile. His eyes weren't wide and innocent. Instead, his face was blank, emotionless. And then, he blinked. But in the mirror, he didn't. Lisa's blood ran cold. Her hands trembled as she turned around. But when she faced him, he was the same. Just a little boy. Just Ethan. Right? To be continued. You said. Continue with the next part. ChatGPT said. Lisa's breath felt stuck in her throat. She forced herself to blink, to shake off the icy dread creeping up her spine. When she looked again, Ethan was just standing there looking up at her normal. Too normal. Lisa whispered, "Everything okay, baby?" Ethan nodded slowly. "Yes, Mommy," he said. His voice was soft, sweet, the same as always. Lisa turned back to the stove, trying to steady her hands as she poured the warm milk into a cup. She was tired. That's all. She was shaken from what had happened at the mall. She took a deep breath, then turned back around. "Here you go, sweetheart," she said, holding out the cup. Ethan took it, his small fingers wrapping around the handle. He took a sip, eyes locked on hers. Lisa sat across from him at the table, watching him. Really watching him. Ethan was always so full of energy. He'd hum, kick his little legs, ramble about his favorite cartoons. But now, he was too quiet. "Are you feeling okay?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "I was scared today," he said softly. Lisa's heart squeezed. She reached out and stroked his hair. "I know, baby, but you're safe now. I've got you." He smiled. A slow, careful smile. Lisa's stomach turned. It didn't feel like a child's smile. It felt rehearsed. She swallowed hard, pushing away the thought. Stop. This was Ethan. Her baby. She had to stop scaring herself. Ethan finished his milk and yawned. "Sleepy," he murmured. Lisa smiled, standing up. "Let's get you to bed, then." She led him upstairs, every step feeling heavier and heavier. She tucked him into bed, kissed his forehead, and pulled the blanket up to his chin. "Good night, Mommy," Ethan said, his eyes wide in the dim glow of the nightlight. "Good night, sweetheart," Lisa whispered. She turned off the light and left the room, pulling the door halfway shut. She needed sleep. That was all. A good night's rest, and everything would feel normal again. She walked down the hall to her own bedroom, rubbing her temples. But just as she reached for the door handle, a whisper froze her in place. "Mommy?" Lisa's blood turned to ice. The voice wasn't coming from Ethan's room. It was coming from behind her, from downstairs. Slowly, heart pounding, Lisa turned her head, and in the darkness of the hallway, Ethan stood at the bottom of the stairs, his small face pale, his eyes wide with fear. His lip trembled. "Mommy, that's not me in my bed." Lisa couldn't breathe. Her entire body locked in place as she stared down the hallway at Ethan, or what looked like Ethan, standing at the bottom of the stairs. Her mind raced. No, that wasn't possible. She had just put him to bed. She had kissed his forehead. She had tucked him in. And yet, here he was. Again. "Mommy?" Ethan whispered, his voice shaking. His real voice. Lisa's stomach twisted into knots. She turned, inching toward the stairs, her pulse hammering in her ears. "Baby, what do you mean?" she whispered. Ethan's eyes filled with tears. "It tricked you," he choked out. "That's not me. I tried to call for you, but you didn't hear me. It wouldn't let me." Lisa's breath hitched. Her knees felt weak. The thing in the bed. If that wasn't Ethan, then what was it? Then, the bedsheets rustled. From down the hall, in Ethan's bedroom, the sound of fabric shifting made Lisa's skin prickle with cold terror. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she slowly turned toward the darkened doorway. A soft creak. Then, a giggle. Low. Hushed. Wrong. Lisa's hands shook violently. The sound of small feet hitting the floor sent chills through her entire body. Something was getting out of the bed. Something was coming. "Mommy!" But it wasn't Ethan's voice. It sounded like him, but it wasn't him. Lisa grabbed Ethan, her hands gripping his tiny shoulders. "Run," she breathed. His tear-streaked face looked up at her, full of fear. "Mommy, run!" Ethan bolted toward the front door. Lisa turned, sprinting after him. But behind her, the sound of small, running footsteps chased them down the hall. Closer, closer. A shadow moved in her peripheral vision. And then, cold fingers clamped around her wrist. "To be continued." "You said." "Continue with the next part." ChatGPT said. Lisa screamed. The grip on her wrist was small but impossibly strong, like ice-cold iron clamping down on her skin. "Mommy," the voice purred. It was Ethan's voice, but wrong. Stretched. Hollow. Lisa yanked her arm, trying to tear away, but the thing wouldn't let go. Her pulse pounded as she turned her head, and saw it. The other Ethan, standing too close, smiling too wide. His dark eyes glimmered in the dim light, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Where are you going?" the thing whispered. Lisa snapped. With every ounce of strength she had, she ripped her wrist free and stumbled backward, gasping. The thing didn't chase her. It just stood there in the darkness, head tilting, lips parting ever so slightly. And it started to hum. Softly, sweetly, a tune Lisa recognized. A lullaby she had sung to Ethan since he was a baby. Tears blurred her vision. "You're not my son," she whispered. The thing just kept humming. Behind her, Ethan was pulling at the front door. "Mommy, it won't open," he sobbed. Lisa spun toward him, lunging for the door. Her hands shook violently as she gripped the lock, twisting, pulling. It wouldn't budge, like the entire house had sealed itself shut. "You can't leave," the thing murmured behind her. Lisa turned her head, and it was right there, its face inches from hers, its lips still curled into that terrible, knowing smile. "You already brought me home, Mommy," it whispered. "Why would you ever leave me behind?" Lisa felt her legs give out. Ethan clung to her, sobbing into her side. The air in the house felt different now. Thicker, heavier, like the walls themselves were closing in. Lisa's mind was screaming, "Think, think," and then she saw it. The mirror by the front door. The thing standing in front of her had no reflection. Lisa's breath hitched. Her fingers curled into Ethan's shirt. She had to get out. Now. Lisa's mind raced. The thing wasn't real. It looked like Ethan. It sounded like Ethan. But it wasn't. And now it was in her home. Ethan was shaking against her side, his fingers digging into her shirt. "Mommy," he whimpered. Lisa's gaze flicked to the mirror again. The thing had no reflection, but she and Ethan did. Her heart pounded. Her hands ached from gripping Ethan too tightly, but she couldn't let go. The thing moved closer. "You don't have to be afraid," it cooed. "I can be a better son. A perfect son. No more crying. No more bad dreams. No more mistakes. Just love. Just happiness. Forever." Lisa clenched her teeth. "You're not my son," she said again, her voice shaking. The thing's smile twitched. For the first time, something flickered in its dark eyes, annoyance. "I look like him," it whispered. Its fingers twitched. "I sound like him." It took another step. "And soon he won't be needed anymore." Lisa's stomach dropped. Her fingers curled into Ethan's hair. "No," she breathed. The thing lurched forward. Lisa grabbed the mirror off the wall and thrust it between them. The thing froze. Its smile vanished. For the first time, it looked afraid. Lisa's chest heaved. "You don't belong here," she hissed. The thing's face twisted. Its lips peeled back. And then, it screamed. Not a human scream. Not Ethan's voice. Something deep. Hollow. Endless. The lights flickered violently. The air rippled. Ethan clutched Lisa's arm, sobbing. The thing staggered backward, hands clawing at its own skin. And suddenly its shape began to change. Stretching. Warping. Unraveling. Lisa didn't wait. She grabbed Ethan and ran. She didn't know where. She didn't care. All she knew was, she had to get him out. Lisa ran. Ethan's small hand was tight in hers as they stumbled through the darkened house. The air felt wrong, heavy and suffocating, as if the walls themselves were breathing. Behind them, the thing let out another piercing scream. Lisa didn't look back. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she yanked Ethan toward the back door. "Hold on, baby, we're almost out," she gasped. Her fingers fumbled for the lock, twisting, pulling. It wouldn't move. "No. No, no, no." She banged on the door, her breath coming in frantic gasps. "Let us out," she screamed. The thing's voice slithered through the air behind her. "Why are you running, Mommy?" Lisa turned her head, and nearly collapsed. It was closer. Its shape was shifting, a grotesque mockery of Ethan, its limbs stretching too long, its mouth curling in a way that wasn't human. Its dark eyes glistened with something hungry. Lisa pressed Ethan behind her. "Stay away from him," she choked out. The thing tilted its head. "But you already let me in," it whispered. The words sent a violent shudder down Lisa's spine. Let it in. Her mind flashed back. To the mall. To the moment she took Ethan's hand without thinking. She had brought it home. Lisa's breath hitched. No. There had to be a way to fix this. Her gaze flicked around the room, searching, desperate. The mirror. The thing had reacted to the mirror. Her stomach clenched. "Ethan," she whispered, forcing her voice to stay calm. "I need you to trust me, okay? Her son's tiny fingers gripped hers. "Oh, okay," he whimpered. Lisa's mind raced. She had one chance. One. Slowly, she edged toward the living room, where the large hallway mirror still hung on the wall. The thing followed, smiling. "You can't run," it hummed. Lisa's heart pounded. "I don't need to," she whispered. With one sharp motion, she grabbed the mirror and turned it toward the thing. The moment the reflection hit it, the house shook. The thing let out a horrible, ear-splitting wail. Its body contorted, rippling like liquid. Dark veins spread across its face, its mouth gaping open in a silent scream. Lisa held firm. "You don't belong here," she hissed. The thing staggered back. The walls groaned. The entire house felt like it was tearing apart. And then, with one last sickening shriek, the thing collapsed into itself, like a shadow being sucked into the floor. The air went still. The house fell silent. Lisa gasped for breath. Ethan clung to her, trembling. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, the back door clicked open. Lisa didn't hesitate. She grabbed Ethan, pulled him outside, and ran into the night. She didn't stop. Not until the house was far behind them. Not until she could no longer hear the whispers. Not until she was sure that the thing was gone. Lisa didn't stop running until she reached the dimly lit parking lot of a 24-hour gas station. The fluorescent lights buzzed above her, casting a cold, sterile glow over the empty lot. She collapsed against the wall, gasping for air, clutching Ethan tightly against her chest. "Mommy!" Ethan whimpered, his little body trembling. Lisa stroked his hair, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "It's okay, baby. We're safe now." But even as she said the words, she knew they weren't entirely true. Her hands still shook. Her heart still pounded. And in the back of her mind, a single, horrifying thought coiled like a snake. What if it wasn't truly gone? Lisa's eyes darted to the glass door of the gas station, her own reflection staring back at her. She hesitated. Could she even trust what she saw? Was that really her? Or was something else looking back? She squeezed her eyes shut, taking a deep breath. Focus, Lisa. Think. She needed a plan. She needed help. But who could she turn to? Who would believe her? A mother losing her child in a mall was normal. A mother bringing home a thing that looked like her child? That sounded like insanity. Lisa reached into her pocket, fumbling for her phone. Her fingers were numb as she dialed the only person she could think of. Her sister, Mara. The phone rang. Once. Twice. 3 times. Then finally, "Lisa?" Mara's groggy voice answered. Lisa nearly sobbed at the sound. "Mara, her voice broke. "Something happened. I need you. Please." Mara instantly sounded more awake. "Where are you? What's wrong?" Lisa glanced around, taking in the name of the gas station. "Sunoco, off Route 7. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Lisa hung up, pulling Ethan closer, whispering over and over, "It's okay. It's okay. It's okay." But was it? Or was it already too late? Lisa sat on the cold concrete curb outside the gas station, rocking Ethan gently in her arms. He had stopped crying, but his breathing was still uneven, little shuddering breaths that made her heart ache. She ran her fingers through his hair, pressing her lips to his forehead. His skin was warm, real, but she still couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The fluorescent lights hummed above her, casting long shadows across the pavement. Every sound made her flinch, the distant roar of a passing car, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the mechanical beep of the gas pumps. She felt watched. Her fingers tightened around her phone, checking the time. 2:17 a.m. Mara should be here any minute. Ethan stirred in her arms, his small hands clutching at her jacket. "Mommy, I'm tired," he whispered. Lisa swallowed hard. "I know, baby. Just hold on a little longer, okay?" His body slumped against hers, exhausted. She wished she could let him sleep. She wished she could believe that he was safe now. But she couldn't. Not yet. A car pulled into the parking lot, its headlights sweeping across Lisa and Ethan. She squinted, shielding her eyes as the vehicle rolled to a stop. Mara. Lisa exhaled a shaky breath as her sister stepped out of the car. Her dark hair pulled into a messy bun, worry etched across her face. Lisa, what the hell is going on? Lisa stood up, Ethan still clinging to her. I don't even know how to explain, she stammered. Mara reached out, brushing Ethan's hair back. Is he okay? Lisa hesitated. Her fingers trembled as she squeezed Ethan tighter. I think so, she whispered. Mara's eyes narrowed. Lisa, what does that mean? Lisa opened her mouth, but no words came out. How could she even begin to explain? How could she tell Mara that just hours ago she had been holding Ethan's hand in a crowded mall, only to look up and see another identical Ethan standing beside a stranger? That when she ran, the other Ethan screamed, "Mommy, don't leave me." Lisa shuddered, the memory slamming into her like a tidal wave. Which one had been real? Which one had been hers? Her throat felt tight, her vision blurred. Mara placed a hand on her shoulder. Lisa, you're scaring me. Lisa blinked, shaking her head. She swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. I need to go somewhere safe. Mara hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Get in the car. Lisa climbed into the passenger seat, cradling Ethan against her chest. Mara pulled out of the parking lot, glancing at Lisa every few seconds. You gonna tell me what happened? Lisa stared out the window, watching the dark trees blur past. Her lips parted, but then, in the reflection of the glass, she saw something that made her blood freeze. Ethan was staring at her, his eyes wide and unblinking. But it wasn't the look of a tired child. It was something else. Something wrong. Something waiting. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. Had she made the right choice? Lisa's hands trembled as she kept her gaze locked on the reflection in the window. Ethan's eyes didn't blink, didn't move. They just stared at her, wide and glassy, as if he were studying her, as if he were waiting for her to notice something. Her breath came shallow. The air in the car felt thick. She turned her head slightly, just enough to glance at Ethan without the glass between them. He was asleep. His small body was curled against her, his chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. Lisa swallowed hard. No, she had seen it. His eyes had been open, watching her. She clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms. Lisa? Mara's voice cut through the silence. Talk to me. What happened? Lisa tried to find the words. She really did. But how could she make sense of something that felt so impossible? She glanced back at Ethan. His eyelashes fluttered slightly in sleep, his tiny fingers curled into the fabric of her jacket. He looked so normal. But was he? Lisa's stomach twisted. She had to be sure. Her fingers brushed against Ethan's hand, lightly tracing over his soft skin. His tiny knuckles, his palm, his wrist. Her breath caught. She felt it. A small, thin scar along the inside of his wrist. Her Ethan had fallen off his bike last summer. He had scraped his wrist on the pavement, leaving behind a faint, silvery scar. Lisa's chest ached with relief. This was her Ethan. She almost laughed out loud, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly. Mara sighed, keeping her eyes on the road. You scared the hell out of me, you know that? Lisa leaned her head back against the seat, exhaustion crashing over her. I know, she whispered. I think I'm losing my mind. Mara scoffed. Tell me something I don't know. Lisa let out a breathy chuckle. The fear that had been wrapped around her lungs started to loosen. Maybe she really had just been overwhelmed, panicked. Maybe her mind had played tricks on her. She closed her eyes. And then, Mommy, her entire body froze. That voice, Ethan's voice, but it hadn't come from her arms. It had come from the back seat. Her stomach plummeted, slowly, as if moving through thick, suffocating air. Lisa turned her head. There, in the darkness of the back seat, something shifted. A small silhouette sat upright, too wide, shining eyes locked onto hers. "Mommy, why did you leave me?" Lisa's heart stopped. Ethan, another Ethan, was staring at her from the shadows. And the one in her arms? He opened his eyes and smiled. Lisa's body went rigid. Her breath hitched. Her heart beat a violent thunder in her ears. The boy in her arms, Ethan, was awake now, watching her. His small lips curled into a smile that was just a little too wide. And in the back seat, the other Ethan sat still in the shadows, his glassy eyes glistening under the dim streetlights passing through the window. "Mommy," the one in the back whispered again, his voice soft but wrong. "Why did you leave me?" Lisa's throat closed. Mara hadn't spoken. Had she not heard it? Lisa's grip on the Ethan in her arms tightened. "Mara," she whispered, "look in the back seat." Mara groaned, her hands gripping the wheel. "Lisa, come on, you're freaking me out." "There's nothing." The car swerved. Mara let out a startled scream as the tires skidded against the asphalt. She yanked the wheel to the right, narrowly missing a street lamp before slamming the brakes. The car jolted to a stop. Lisa was thrown forward, barely catching herself as she shielded Ethan with her arms. Silence. Only the sound of their ragged breathing filled the space. Mara's hands shook against the steering wheel. "What the hell was that?" she gasped. Lisa didn't answer. She was staring into the back seat. It was empty. The other Ethan was gone. Her stomach lurched. She turned to Mara, her voice barely a whisper. "You saw him, didn't you?" Mara didn't respond right away. Her hands clenched the wheel so tight her knuckles turned white. Finally, she nodded. Lisa swallowed. "Then where did he go?" Mara slowly turned to look at her. Her face was pale. "Lisa," she whispered, "are you sure the one you're holding is Ethan?" Lisa felt ice crawl up her spine. She looked down. Ethan, her Ethan, was staring up at her. His eyes were wide, too wide. He tilted his head, and then he laughed. A slow, hollow, unnatural sound. Lisa's blood ran cold. This wasn't her son. This wasn't Ethan. Lisa's breath came in short, sharp gasps. Her arms stiffened around the small body in her lap, her muscles screaming at her to let go, to drop him, to run. But she couldn't move. Ethan, not Ethan, kept laughing. A slow, hollow sound that didn't belong in the body of a child. Mara's voice was barely a whisper. "Lisa, get out of the car." Lisa's fingers twitched. The thing in her arms tilted its head further, its neck bending at an unnatural angle. "Mommy," it said, its voice sweet, innocent, but wrong. "Where are we going?" Lisa's stomach twisted into knots. Her mind screamed, "This is not Ethan, this is not Ethan, this is not Ethan," but her body wouldn't move. Then Mara lunged. She grabbed Lisa's wrist and yanked her so hard the seatbelt snapped against her shoulder. The car door flew open. Lisa barely had time to react before she was dragged out into the cold night air, stumbling onto the pavement. She heard a thud, something hitting the car seat. The thing that looked like Ethan had fallen forward. Lisa's vision spun as Mara pulled her further away from the car, gripping her arms so tight it hurt. "Lisa, look at me. Look at me." Lisa's chest heaved. She could barely focus on Mara's face, her own heartbeat roaring in her ears. "That thing isn't Ethan," Mara said, her voice shaking. "We need to." A soft click. The sound of the car door opening. Lisa and Mara both froze. Slowly, so slowly, Lisa turned her head. The door on the passenger side was wide open. Ethan, the thing wearing Ethan's face, was gone. The night around them was silent. Still, Lisa's skin crawled. She couldn't see him. She couldn't hear him. But she could feel him. Watching. Waiting. Mara tightened her grip on Lisa's wrist. "We have to go," she whispered. Lisa swallowed, her throat dry. "But where?" Mara hesitated. Then a voice, small, fragile, echoed from the darkness. "Mommy, please don't leave me again." Lisa's stomach dropped. The voice was coming from the trees. from deep inside the woods. Mara's hands tightened. "Lisa, don't." But it was too late. Lisa was already moving. Her body acted before her mind could catch up, before the fear could root her in place. She stumbled forward, her breath hitching, her feet carrying her toward the trees. Because what if? What if that was really him? What if she was about to leave her real son behind? The trees loomed ahead, tall and black against the night sky. And from somewhere in the shadows, a small hand reached out. "Mommy, help me." Lisa's vision blurred. It was him. It had to be him. She stepped forward, and something grabbed her. A hand clamped onto her wrist, yanking her back so hard her feet left the ground. "Mara." Her voice was a desperate, panicked scream. "Lisa, no." Lisa's head snapped back just in time to see the small hand stretching further. Too far. The fingers elongated, the skin splitting, stretching, forming into something else. Something inhuman. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. And then, the thing smiled. Lisa's stomach twisted. The thing in the trees, the thing wearing Ethan's voice, kept its hand outstretched, its fingers unnaturally long, curling like grasping roots. Then it tilted its head. A sharp, cracking sound echoed through the woods as its neck bent at an impossible angle. Lisa's breath hitched. Her legs felt weak, but Mara's grip on her wrist was iron tight, keeping her from stepping forward. "Lisa!" Mara's voice was urgent, her breath hot against Lisa's ear. "That is not Ethan. We need to leave. Now." Lisa couldn't move. Because what if? What if her son was really out there, trapped, waiting for her? What if she left him behind? "Mommy," the voice whimpered again, softer now. Weaker, like a child on the verge of tears. Lisa's heart ached. Her body wavered. "Lisa, don't you dare," Mara hissed. And then, the thing moved. One moment, it was standing at the tree line. The next, it was rushing toward them. A blur of shadows and limbs, moving too fast, too fluid, its fingers reaching. Lisa screamed. Mara yanked her backward, nearly knocking them both off their feet. The thing lurched to a stop, its face inches from Lisa's own. And now, up close, she could see. The face was wrong. Ethan's features were there, the same round cheeks, the same wide eyes, but stretched, distorted, like a poor imitation. The eyes were too dark, the mouth too wide. Lisa's breath shattered in her chest. Then the thing smiled. Its lips peeled back, revealing rows of small, needle-like teeth. Lisa choked on a sob. The thing's voice was still Ethan's voice, still soft, still fragile. "Mommy," it whispered. Then, it lunged. Mara shoved Lisa aside just as the thing snapped forward, its fingers clawing through the air where Lisa's throat had been. Lisa hit the ground hard, pain jolting up her knees. Mara was already moving, grabbing her, pulling her, forcing her up. "Run!" Mara screamed. Lisa's body reacted before her mind did. She scrambled to her feet and bolted. The trees blurred around her as she ran, her pulse pounding in her ears. Behind her, footsteps. Fast. Too fast. And a sound, chittering laughter, garbled and wet, like something trying to mimic a child's giggle, but getting it horribly, horribly wrong. Lisa didn't dare look back. Mara was just ahead, pulling her forward, her grip the only thing keeping Lisa from falling apart completely. They burst from the trees, stumbling onto pavement. The parking lot. The car was right there. "Get in!" Mara shouted. Lisa fumbled with the handle, yanking the door open, throwing herself inside just as Mara slammed the locks down. For a moment, silence. Lisa's chest heaved. Her hands trembled as she gripped the dashboard. Mara was panting beside her, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. And then, a small knock at Lisa's window. Her heart stopped. Slowly, so slowly, she turned her head. And there, standing just outside the car, Ethan, or something that looked like him. Its little hand rested against the glass, its head tilted at that same, awful angle. Lisa's stomach twisted. because now she could see. The reflection in the window didn't match. The thing outside was smiling, but in the glass, its face was blank. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. The thing outside the car stood perfectly still, its hand pressed against the glass, its head still twisted at that awful, unnatural angle. But its reflection, its lack of expression, made Lisa's stomach churn. This wasn't Ethan. It had never been Ethan. "Drive," Lisa whispered, her voice barely there. Mara didn't move. Her hands were frozen on the wheel, her eyes locked onto the thing outside. Lisa could see the way her chest rose and fell in shallow, panicked breaths. The thing outside knocked again. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was too hollow, too deliberate. Lisa's whole body tensed. "Mara," she whispered again. "We have to go." Mara blinked, snapping out of whatever trance had gripped her. With a sharp breath, she reached for the keys. Click. The sound came from Lisa's door. Her lock had popped up. Lisa's stomach lurched. She hadn't touched it. Neither had Mara. Her fingers darted toward it, pushing it down, but the moment she did, click. It popped back up again. Lisa's breath turned shallow. "Mara," she croaked. Mara didn't hesitate. She twisted the keys in the ignition, and the engine roared to life. The thing outside reacted instantly. Its face slammed against the window, its too wide mouth splitting into an ear-to-ear grin, its eyes black pits of hunger. Lisa screamed. Mara threw the car into reverse, the tires screeching as they peeled backward. The thing's head dragged against the glass, leaving a faint smear of something dark. And then, it laughed. The sound was a perfect mimicry of Ethan's giggle, but it was wrong. Stretched, echoing, like it came from inside their own heads. Lisa's hands flew to her ears, trying to shut it out, but it didn't stop. It was inside her skull. Mara slammed the car into drive. "Hold on," she shouted. The tires screeched again as they shot forward, Lisa's body jerking against the seat. Through the windshield, the thing stood right in their path, but Mara didn't stop. Lisa barely had time to scream before the car hit it head-on. A sickening crunch filled the air, but there was no impact. No thud, no weight against the hood. They passed through it. Lisa twisted in her seat, staring out the back window, expecting to see a crumpled body on the pavement. But there was nothing, just the empty parking lot. The thing was gone. Lisa's stomach twisted. Her body trembled. "Did we?" She couldn't even finish the thought. Mara didn't answer. She just kept driving. Faster. Away from the mall. Away from that thing. Away from whatever had worn her son's face. Lisa turned forward again, her breath shaky, her mind racing. And then, a voice from the back seat. "Mommy, why did you leave me?" Lisa's blood froze. Her hands gripped the dashboard, her breath caught in her lungs. Slowly, Mara's eyes met hers in the rearview mirror. Lisa didn't want to look. She didn't. But something deep inside her forced her to. Her head turned. And there, sitting in the middle of the back seat, was Ethan, his face streaked with tears, his small hands trembling, his eyes wide with hurt. Real. Or not. Lisa's heart twisted in her chest. Tears burned her eyes. She wanted to believe it. She needed to believe it. "Mommy," Ethan whimpered again. His lips quivered. "It's really me. Please, don't leave me again." Lisa's hand shook as she reached for him. Mara's voice snapped through the silence. "Lisa, don't." Lisa's fingers froze inches away from Ethan's hand. And then, Ethan smiled. Wide. Too wide. Lisa's stomach dropped. The thing in the back seat wasn't her son. And now, it knew she knew. Lisa's breath hitched. The thing wearing Ethan's face kept smiling, its lips stretching too far, revealing teeth that were just a little too sharp. Mara's hands clenched around the wheel, her knuckles turning white. She didn't look back. She didn't dare. "Lisa," Mara said, her voice low and steady. "Do not move. Do not speak to it. Do not acknowledge it. Lisa's body trembled. But how could she ignore it? It looked so much like Ethan. It smelled like him, like baby shampoo and the faintest hint of the chocolate ice cream he had eaten earlier. And yet, she knew. She knew this wasn't her child. Lisa's fingers curled into fists. "Mara," she whispered, barely breathing. "What do we do?" Mara kept her eyes on the road. "We drive," she said, "and we do not stop." Lisa swallowed. Behind her, the thing shifted. It was getting closer. She didn't hear it move, but she felt it. The air turned thick, heavy wrong. Lisa's whole body went rigid. And then, a small, cold hand wrapped around her wrist. Lisa's breath vanished. The grip was too strong, too cold. "Mommy," the voice whispered. "Why are you scared of me?" Lisa clenched her jaw. "Don't respond. Don't react." The hand tightened. "Look at me, Mommy." Lisa's stomach churned. She bit her lip until she tasted blood. "Look at me." The voice had changed. It was deeper now. Wrong. Something was pressing against her mind, pushing, forcing, demanding. Lisa squeezed her eyes shut. The air in the car turned frigid. Her breath came out in shaky, white puffs. Mara's voice was sharp, urgent. "Lisa, whatever happens, do not turn around." Lisa's entire body screamed at her to listen. But the thing's hand slid up her arm. The cold burned through her skin. "Mommy," it rasped. Lisa's resolve cracked. She turned, and there was nothing. The back seat was empty. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. The air was still heavy, still thick. But Ethan was gone. Lisa's heart pounded. "Mara," she started. And then, the car jerked. The whole vehicle shook violently, tires screeching against the pavement. Mara fought to control the wheel, her teeth gritted, eyes wild. "It's trying to stop us," she yelled. Lisa whipped around just in time to see something slam against the back windshield. Her stomach dropped. It was Ethan, or what was left of him. His face was twisted, his eyes sunken and hollow, his mouth split into that terrible, endless grin. But his arms were too long now, too thin. His fingers scraped against the glass, leaving deep, black streaks. Lisa screamed. Mara slammed the gas. The car lurched forward, the force throwing Lisa back against her seat. The thing shrieked. Not Ethan's voice. Not even close. It was something ancient. Something that should have never been let in. And yet, Lisa had turned around. And now, it was inside. The shriek rattled Lisa's skull, a piercing, inhuman wail that clawed at her brain like nails on glass. Mara gritted her teeth, slamming the gas pedal to the floor. The car lurched forward, tires screaming as they fought for grip. Lisa's breath came in short, ragged gasps. The thing, Ethan but not Ethan, was still clinging to the back windshield, its fingers stretched long and wrong, pressing against the glass. But then, it started to sink. Like a shadow melting into the car, its body bled through the glass, its limbs stretching and twisting, seeping into the space between the seats. Lisa choked back a scream. "Mara," she gasped. "It's getting inside." Mara's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. Big mistake. Her pupils dilated. Her hands jerked on the wheel. The car swerved, nearly spinning off the road. "Don't look at it!" Lisa cried. Mara squeezed her eyes shut, knuckles white on the wheel. "Hold on," she yelled. Lisa barely had time to brace before the car plunged off the road, crashing through the trees. Branches slashed against the windows. The tires hit uneven ground. The car tipped, tilted. And then, silence. Lisa's body was thrown forward against the dashboard. The seatbelt dug into her chest, pain exploding in her ribs. A ringing filled her ears. For a second, all she could hear was her own heartbeat. And then, a whisper. Right in her ear. "Mommy, where are you going?" Lisa's blood ran cold. The voice wasn't behind her anymore. It was next to her. Her head turned slowly, unwillingly. And there it was. sitting in the passenger seat. Ethan, or the thing that wore his face. Its grin was wider now, stretching too far, its eyes too dark, too empty. Lisa's breath shuddered. "You're not my son," she whispered. The thing tilted its head. "I am if you believe I am," it said. Lisa's body locked up. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Mara groaned from the driver's seat, her head slumped forward. Lisa forced herself to reach out, but Ethan's hand shot forward, grabbing her wrist. "Cold. Too cold. Don't leave me again, Mommy." Lisa's stomach twisted. And then, the thing's face began to change. The skin bubbled. The mouth stretched. The eyes, they bled into the darkness, turning into two gaping holes. And then, it lunged. Lisa screamed, jerking back as the thing lunged at her, its mouth splitting open too wide, revealing rows of blackened, jagged teeth. Her body reacted on instinct. She ripped her arm free and threw herself backward, scrambling against the car door. Mara groaned again, her fingers twitching against the steering wheel. "Mara, wake up!" Lisa gasped. The thing crawled over the center console, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being yanked by invisible strings. It grinned. "You keep running, Mommy," it said, voice distorted, layered with something deeper. "But you always come back to me." Lisa's fingers fumbled for the door handle, yanked it open. She fell out of the car, landing hard on the cold, damp ground. The wind rushed past her ears. The forest was too dark, the air thick with the smell of rain and wet leaves. She looked back. Silence. The car was still. The thing was gone. Lisa's breath came in ragged gasps. She swallowed, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. A groan. She spun around. Mara was stirring in the driver's seat, her head lifting slowly. "Mara!" Lisa pushed herself up, grabbing the door. "We have to get out of here." Mara blinked, confused, and then her expression changed. Her eyes widened in horror. Lisa barely had time to react before Mara screamed. "Lisa, behind you!" Cold breath whispered against the back of Lisa's neck. She froze. Her stomach dropped into nothingness. And then, fingers, sliding over her shoulders. Too many fingers. Lisa's mind shattered into pure animal terror. She whipped around, but the thing was already there. Too close. Its face wasn't Ethan's anymore. It was hers. Her own face, grinning, eyes hollow, lips curling too wide. Lisa's legs gave out. She tried to scream, but the thing pressed a hand to her mouth, its fingers sinking into her skin like wet clay. Everything tilted. The world warped. And then, the thing leaned in, its breath cold and rancid. "Come home, Lisa," and yanked her into the dark. Lisa hit the ground hard, her body sinking into something cold and soft. Her lungs burned, her throat raw from a scream that never came. The darkness around her shifted, moving like thick smoke, pressing against her skin. It wasn't the mall. It wasn't the car. It wasn't the forest. It was somewhere else. She scrambled up, her hands sinking into the damp, pulsing ground. It felt alive beneath her fingertips, like the inside of something breathing. A faint glow flickered in the distance. Lisa turned, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. And then, a voice. "Mommy." Lisa's stomach tightened into knots. She knew that voice. "Ethan." She whirled around, eyes darting through the shifting dark. "Ethan?" Her voice cracked. "Ethan, where are you?" A shadow moved just beyond the glow. Small. Still. Lisa ran toward it, her feet sinking into the soft, living earth. "Baby, I'm here. It's okay. I'm here." The closer she got, the clearer the figure became. A child, standing perfectly still. Lisa slowed, her breath ragged. The glow flickered, casting a dull, sickly light over his form. It was Ethan, her son. His back was turned to her, his small shoulders rising and falling with slow, deep breaths. Lisa's chest ached. Tears burned her eyes. Ethan, she sobbed, reaching out. Baby, turn around. Let me see you. Ethan moved, slowly, but not naturally. His head turned first, too far, too slow, before his body followed, like something was dragging him from inside. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. His face. It wasn't right. His skin was pale, his lips cracked and dry. His eyes. Black. Not just dark. Empty. Hollow. Lisa staggered back, her mind screaming at her to run. You came back, Ethan said, his voice not quite right. Layered. Lisa shook her head. Ethan, we have to go. We have to. Why do you keep running, Mommy? The darkness behind him shifted. Something moved inside it. And then, another Ethan stepped forward. Lisa gasped, her knees going weak. The second Ethan was identical. Same clothes. Same height. Same hollow eyes. Then another stepped forward. And another. And another. Lisa's heartbeat thundered in her ears. A wall of Ethans surrounded her. Their heads tilted in unison. And then, they spoke together. You belong here now, Mommy. Lisa screamed. The darkness rushed toward her, swallowing her whole. Lisa fell backward, her breath caught in her throat. The darkness wrapped around her, pulling at her arms, her legs, her very mind. The voices of the many Ethans whispered together, a sound like wind rushing through hollow bones. You belong here now, Mommy. Lisa clawed at the ground, desperate to pull herself away. The Ethan copies loomed closer, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Their small hands reached out, fingers curling like claws. No, no, you are not my son. Lisa screamed, thrashing against the suffocating blackness. The real Ethan was somewhere in here. He had to be. Ethan, she called out, her voice raw, desperate. Baby, I know you're here. You have to fight this. You have to come back to me. The figures froze. For a moment, the air itself seemed to still. Then, one of the Ethans twitched, his body shuddering as if something inside him was breaking free. His small hands clenched into fists, his mouth quivering. Lisa's heart leaped. Mommy! His voice was different. Not layered. Not hollow. It was his voice. The real Ethan. Lisa lunged forward, pushing past the other figures, reaching for the one that stood trembling in the middle of them all. Ethan! It's me, baby! Come to me! His black eyes flickered, like something was stirring inside him. The darkness shifted violently, the air filling with a low, growling sound. The Ethan copies reacted, their mouths opening wide in soundless shrieks. Their faces stretched, warping into something inhuman. Lisa grabbed Ethan's wrist, yanking him toward her. Hold on to me, baby. Don't let go. Ethan sobbed, his small hands clutching at her arms as she pulled him close. The darkness howled, the Ethan copies lunging toward them. Lisa squeezed her eyes shut. And then, she ran. You said, conclude the story in the next 3 responses. ChatGPT said. Lisa sprinted through the dark, clutching Ethan tightly against her chest. The shadows around them twisted, writhing like living things. The air was thick, pressing against her skin, filling her lungs with something cold and wrong. Behind them, the other Ethans shrieked, their voices melding into one deafening, monstrous wail. Mommy! Ethan sobbed into her shoulder, his tiny hands clutching her shirt. Lisa's legs burned as she ran, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. She had no idea where she was going. There was no light, no direction, just endless black, but she refused to stop. Hold on, baby, hold on, she gasped. Something brushed her ankle. A small, cold hand. Lisa kicked out wildly, nearly losing her footing. Then, a glow. Faint, distant, but real. A light somewhere ahead. Her chest tightened with hope. Ethan, do you see that? Ethan lifted his head, his tear-streaked face turning toward the dim glow. Mommy, I want to go home, he whimpered. Lisa held him tighter. We will, baby. I promise. She ran toward the light, ignoring the hands grasping at her, the voices screeching behind them. The glow grew brighter. The darkness screamed. And then, she burst through. Lisa stumbled forward, nearly falling as she broke through the darkness. The air around her shifted violently, like stepping through an invisible wall. The shadows behind her howled, furious, but they could not follow. She clutched Ethan, shielding his face as they collapsed onto a hard, cold surface. For a moment, she couldn't move. Her body ached. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her mind still reeling from the nightmare she had just escaped. Then, a sound, the distant hum of voices, the faint melody of a mall's overhead speakers. Lisa's eyes snapped open. She was back. The polished tile floor of the shopping mall gleamed beneath her. Bright, artificial lights burned overhead. People walked past, oblivious, shoppers, families, employees, as if nothing had happened, as if she had never left. Her arms tightened around Ethan. He was shaking, face buried in her shoulder, his little body warm, real, alive. "Ethan," Lisa whispered, her voice breaking. He lifted his head slowly, his tear-streaked face blinking up at her. His eyes, they were no longer black and hollow. They were his eyes again, warm, brown. Her Ethan. Lisa let out a choked sob, pressing desperate kisses to his hair, his forehead, his cheeks. "You're okay, baby. You're okay. We're home. We're home." Ethan clung to her, whispering, "Mommy, I was so scared." Lisa rocked him gently, trying to steady her own breathing. The nightmare was over. But then, she saw them, across the mall, a group of children standing near the entrance. Silent, still, watching her. Their faces were identical to Ethan's. Lisa's breath hitched. The children stood motionless, their identical faces expressionless, their empty eyes locked onto hers. There were 5 of them, each one Ethan's exact double. Their small hands hung limp at their sides, their lips slightly parted, as if they were waiting. Waiting for what? Lisa's arms tightened around Ethan, her pulse pounding in her ears. "No," she whispered. "You can't have him. He's mine." The children tilted their heads in eerie unison. A slow, synchronized movement. And then they smiled. Not a child's smile. Too wide. Too sharp. Too knowing. Lisa's stomach twisted. The mall around them buzzed with life. Shoppers passing by without a second glance, unaware of the horror standing just a few feet away. Nobody else saw them. Nobody else knew. Ethan whimpered against her chest. "Mommy, they're still here." Lisa gripped him tighter, her hands trembling. "Don't look at them, baby. Just hold on to me." The children didn't move. They just stood there, smiling, watching, waiting. Lisa turned, clutching Ethan close, and walked away as fast as she could, her entire body shaking. She didn't run. She couldn't. Somehow she knew if she ran they would follow. As she disappeared into the crowd, she dared one last glance over her shoulder. The children were still there, still smiling, still watching. And then, one of them lifted a hand and waved. Let's start with the next story. The antique locket lay on the table, its silver surface tarnished with age. Evelyn hesitated before picking it up. It had belonged to her grandmother, passed down for generations. But something about it felt wrong. "Are you really going to wear that?" James said, leaning against the doorway. Evelyn turned the locket over in her fingers. "It's been in the family for years. Mom said it was special." James scoffed. "Yeah, special in the worst way." Evelyn frowned. "What do you mean?" Her brother shifted uncomfortably. "Grandma used to say it was cursed. Dad didn't believe her. But remember how she was near the end? Always mumbling about memories, about getting lost in them." Evelyn did remember. Their grandmother had spent her final days rambling about moments from her past, things she had already lived, as if she were trapped in them. She had died clutching the locket. Evelyn shook off the unease and snapped it open. Inside was an old photograph, a young woman's face, blurred and faded. A name was etched inside. Amelia. A strange chill ran down Evelyn's spine. Just don't put it on, James warned. That thing gives me the creeps. Evelyn smiled. You don't actually believe in curses, do you? James didn't answer. He just walked away. Evelyn sighed and clasped the locket around her neck. And then, the world shifted. The dim light in her room flickered. The air grew heavy. Suddenly, she wasn't standing in her apartment anymore. She was somewhere else. Somewhere she knew. A hospital hallway. Cold. Bright. The smell of antiseptic thick in the air. She turned. Her breath caught in her throat. Down the hall, she saw herself. Sitting in a chair. Hands shaking. Tears streaming down her face. Evelyn's heart pounded. She knew this place. She knew this moment. It was the night her mother died. Evelyn's breath hitched as she stumbled forward, her heart pounding. The walls of the hospital stretched endlessly, the fluorescent lights flickering above her. She tried to convince herself it wasn't real. This is just a memory, she whispered. I'm not really here. But the cold of the tile beneath her bare feet, the distant murmur of nurses down the hallway, the beeping of machines, it all felt too real. She turned her gaze back to the waiting room. There she was, her past self, sitting motionless, fingers digging into her arms, her face pale and streaked with tears. Mom's gone, the past Evelyn whispered, voice hollow. A sob caught in Evelyn's throat. She didn't want to relive this. She had spent years trying to forget. The locket around her neck felt heavier, like it was pulling her down. And then, something changed. The waiting room lights dimmed. A shadow stretched across the floor. Evelyn turned her head slowly. There, at the end of the hallway, stood a figure. It wasn't a doctor. It wasn't a nurse. It was a woman in an old-fashioned dress, her features blurred like a faded photograph. Amelia, Evelyn whispered. The woman took a step forward. The air around Evelyn grew thick, pressing against her chest. She tried to move, tried to run, but her body wouldn't obey. Amelia raised one hand. And then, the world collapsed. The hospital vanished. Evelyn was somewhere else. Her childhood home. The living room, dimly lit by the glow of a Christmas tree. The scent of cinnamon in the air. The soft hum of a holiday song playing from the radio. Her heart clenched. She knew this night. It was the last Christmas before everything changed. Before her father walked out. Before their family fell apart. No, Evelyn whispered, gripping the locket. I don't want to be here. But the past was already unfolding before her. Her younger self sat cross-legged on the floor, unwrapping a gift. Across the room, her father stood near the doorway, his hands clenched into fists. Her mother stood beside him, pleading. Don't do this, her mother begged. Please, Mark. It's already done, her father said coldly. The younger Evelyn looked up, her face falling. Dad! Her father turned his back. He walked out the door. The younger Evelyn screamed his name. And just like that, the Christmas lights flickered and died. The house was plunged into darkness. Evelyn's chest tightened. She felt something behind her. She turned. Amelia stood inches away. Stop! Evelyn gasped. Why are you showing me this? But Amelia only tilted her head, her hollow eyes glinting in the dim light. And then, the world shifted again. Evelyn gasped as the world lurched, the air around her twisting like a thick fog. When the dizziness passed, she found herself standing in a dark, damp basement. The walls were lined with shelves covered in dust, old boxes stacked carelessly in the corners. The air smelled of mildew and something foul, something rotting. She swallowed hard. She knew this place. It was the basement of her childhood home, the place she swore she would never go back to. Her pulse quickened. She didn't want to see what came next. Please, she whispered, gripping the locket. Not this. Take me anywhere but here. But the locket's chain burned against her skin, and the past continued to unravel before her eyes. A single, bare light bulb flickered overhead. And then, a child's cry echoed through the basement. Evelyn's stomach knotted. She turned toward the sound. Across the room, huddled in the corner, was her younger self. A girl no older than 6, her small hands clutched around her knees, sobbing. Evelyn could barely breathe. She remembered this moment too well. It was the night her mother had locked her in the basement as punishment. "I was just a kid," Evelyn whispered, a lump forming in her throat. The memory played out before her, cruel and unrelenting. The basement door creaked open. Footsteps descended the stairs. Her mother's voice, sharp and impatient. "Enough with the crying. You'll come out when you learn to behave." The little Evelyn looked up, her tear-streaked face filled with fear. "Please, Mommy," the child whimpered. "I'm scared." Her mother didn't answer. She simply turned away. The basement door slammed shut. Darkness swallowed the room. The child's cries grew frantic, her tiny hands pounding against the wooden door. "Mommy," she sobbed. "Let me out. I'll be good, I promise." Evelyn clenched her fists, her whole body shaking. "Stop," she whispered. "Please, just stop." But the locket only grew heavier, the air around her growing thick with shadows. And then, the little girl froze. Her cries ceased. Evelyn's breath hitched. The child turned her head slowly, as if she could sense Evelyn watching. And then, her lips curled into a smile that did not belong on a child's face. "You can't run from us," the younger Evelyn whispered. "We are you, and we will never let you go." The room plunged into utter darkness, and Evelyn felt something cold grab her wrist. Evelyn screamed. The grip on her wrist was ice cold, like the touch of something long dead. She tried to yank her arm away, but the force holding her was unyielding. The darkness swirled around her, pressing in from all sides. It was as if the very air had turned solid, trapping her inside the nightmare. Then, a whisper right against her ear. "Why do you fight it?" Evelyn's breath hitched. The voice was her own, but not from her lips. Something moved in the shadows. A figure stepped forward. It was her, but not the little girl this time. It was her adult self, standing in the dim basement light, smiling. Her reflection in the mirror of the past. But wrong. Its skin was too pale, its eyes too dark, and the way it tilted its head was unnatural, like a puppet waiting for its strings to be pulled. "You've carried the curse for so long," the other Evelyn whispered. "Why not let it consume you?" Evelyn shook her head violently. "No," she choked out. "This isn't real. None of this is real." Her doppelganger stepped closer. "Aren't you tired?" it murmured. "Tired of running? Tired of fighting?" Evelyn staggered back, her heart hammering. The walls around her shuddered, as if something massive was breathing beneath them. The air thickened, pressing on her chest. "The locket!" Her fingers tightened around it. "Break the curse before you're trapped forever." The words echoed in her mind. She had to fight. She had to break free. But how? The other Evelyn's smile widened. "There's only one way," it whispered. And then, it lunged at her. Evelyn screamed as the world split apart. Evelyn fell backward, her body hitting the cold, hard ground. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs, but she forced herself to scramble away, her fingers digging into the dust-covered floor. Her doppelganger crawled toward her, its movements jerky, like a marionette with tangled strings. Its dark eyes locked onto hers, and its mouth twisted into a hungry grin. "You can't escape," it whispered. Evelyn's fingers found something on the ground, a shard of glass from the shattered mirror. Without thinking, she snatched it up and slashed at the figure. The glass tore through its skin, but instead of blood, black smoke poured from the wound. The doppelganger shrieked, its voice splitting into 1,000 echoes that bounced off the walls. The room shook violently. The shadows on the walls rippled, shifting like living things. The house was coming apart. Evelyn's mind raced. She had to destroy the locket. She stumbled to her feet, her vision blurred by the swirling darkness. The locket burned hot against her skin, the whispers growing louder, pleading, begging her not to do it. "Let me go!" she shouted, raising the locket high. The doppelganger lunged at her again, its arms outstretched. Evelyn hurled the locket onto the ground with all her strength. The metal cracked, splitting open like an egg. A deafening scream erupted from within. The air rippled, the shadows collapsed inward, and the doppelganger's face twisted in agony. "No! No, no, no!" It screeched as its body crumbled into black mist. The whispers cut off. The house lurched. And then, silence. Evelyn lay on the floor, gasping for breath. The world around her was still. The darkness was gone. The locket lay in ruins, its pieces nothing but cold, lifeless metal. She had done it. The curse was broken. Evelyn lay still for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. The air felt lighter, as if the weight of 1,000 voices had lifted. The house was silent, no whispers, no shifting shadows, no doppelgangers crawling from the darkness. She sat up slowly, her body aching. The shattered locket lay in pieces beside her, nothing more than broken metal and dust. Whatever had been inside, the curse, the entity, the endless torment was gone. For the first time in what felt like forever, she was alone. A breeze stirred through the open doorway, carrying the scent of earth and rain. She hadn't even realized the storm had passed. Pushing herself to her feet, Evelyn took one last look at the room. It was just that, a room. The walls were no longer breathing, the shadows no longer watching. It felt like a place abandoned, long forgotten. She turned away and made her way down the hall. The house groaned as if releasing a final breath, the lingering remains of something that had haunted it for too long. As she stepped outside, the air was cool against her skin. The first light of dawn touched the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of purple and gray. Evelyn exhaled, a slow, trembling breath. She had survived. The curse was broken. And yet, as she walked toward her car, something made her stop. A flicker of movement in the reflection of the car's window. Her breath caught. She turned slowly. Nothing was there. Just the empty road, the quiet house, and the first rays of morning stretching across the land. Evelyn swallowed hard and shook her head. It was over. It had to be. Without another glance back, she got into the car, started the engine, and drove away. But if she had looked one last time, if she had truly watched, she might have seen it. A faint shimmer in the glass. A pair of dark eyes staring back at her, and the whisper of a voice just beneath the wind. Did you really think you could escape? Let's start with the next story. Sophia woke up to a strange sensation on her arm. It wasn't pain exactly, more like a dull, crawling itch beneath her skin. She frowned, still groggy, and pulled up the sleeve of her nightshirt. That was when she saw it. A mark. It was small at first, no larger than a coin, resting just below her wrist. The shape was unclear, almost like a burn that hadn't fully healed. The edges were dark, as though ink had seeped into her skin. She ran a finger over it. Cold. That was strange. Shouldn't it feel warm if it was an infection? She sat up, trying to recall if she had injured herself the day before. Maybe she had bumped into something and just didn't remember. But no, this looked deliberate, like a symbol pressed into her skin. A brand. A chill crept through her body. She told herself it was nothing, just a rash or maybe an allergic reaction. Still, something about it made her uneasy. Shaking off the feeling, she got out of bed and headed to the bathroom. The light flickered when she switched it on. The bulb was old. She had been meaning to replace it. She turned on the tap and splashed cold water on her face. When she looked up, her reflection seemed off. The shadows under her eyes looked darker than usual, her skin paler, and for a split second, she thought she saw something move behind her in the mirror. A dark blur. She spun around. Nothing. Sophia exhaled, shaking her head. She was just tired. That was all. But then she heard it. A whisper. At first, it was so faint she thought it was the wind outside. But no, it was closer. Inside the room. A soft voice. curling around her ears, just below the edge of understanding. Then, clear as day, she heard it. "Do you see me?" Sophia's breath hitched. She grabbed the sink, steadying herself. "You hear me now, don't you?" She turned sharply, looking around. "Who's there?" she asked. Silence. Her own breath was the only sound in the room. The whisper was gone. She looked back at her arm. The mark was darker now, spreading. Sophia's heart pounded as she stared at the mark. It had definitely grown. The dark edges stretched further up her forearm, the shape becoming more distinct, almost like tendrils creeping under her skin. She swallowed hard. Maybe it was just her imagination. Maybe she was overreacting. She needed to go to work. Routine would help. Forcing herself to ignore the growing unease, she got dressed and made her way to the kitchen. As she poured herself a cup of coffee, a cold shiver ran down her spine. The apartment felt different this morning. Heavier. The air was thick, like something unseen was pressing against her. Then, just as she lifted the mug to her lips, she heard it again. "You're mine now." She froze. The voice was right next to her ear. Soft. Icy. She spun around, knocking the coffee cup onto the floor. It shattered, the sound sharp and jarring. But there was no one there. Her breathing was fast and uneven. She grabbed her coat, deciding she needed to leave, needed to be around other people. The subway ride to work was a blur. She kept her hands in her lap, covering the mark. But even then, she swore she could feel something moving beneath her skin, like tiny roots burrowing deeper. She tried to focus on the noise around her, the hum of the train, the murmur of conversations. But in the gaps of silence, the whispers returned. "You can't ignore me. Look at your arm. Let me in." Sophia clenched her fists. She refused to look. But then something happened that made her stomach drop. The man sitting across from her, a complete stranger, lifted his head and locked eyes with her. His face was blank, his eyes dark and hollow. And then, in a voice that didn't belong to him, he whispered, "I see you too." Sophia stumbled to her feet, nearly tripping as the train lurched to a stop. She pushed past the crowd, desperate to get away. As she stepped onto the platform, she dared a glance at her arm. The mark had spread to her elbow, and this time she could see something shifting beneath the skin, something alive. Sophia's breath hitched as she hurried through the station. Her arm burned, the mark pulsing as if it had a heartbeat of its own. She didn't dare stop. The stranger's whisper still echoed in her mind, those empty eyes seeing something they shouldn't have. She burst onto the street, the cold morning air hitting her like a slap. People moved past her, unaware of her panic. She swallowed hard and forced herself forward toward the office. She needed normalcy. She needed to pretend nothing was wrong. The moment she stepped inside the building, she felt a brief wave of relief. Fluorescent lights, ringing phones, the scent of coffee, all of it grounded her. Just get through the day. She reached her desk, ignoring the lingering sensation of something watching her. But the moment she sat down, a cold whisper snaked through her mind. "You can't escape me." Sophia flinched. She squeezed her eyes shut, luring the voice away. When she opened them again, her screen was black. Her fingers trembled as she tapped the keyboard. The monitor flickered to life, but instead of her usual work screen, words filled the screen. "Let me in." Her stomach twisted. The words repeated over and over, multiplying across the screen in an endless loop. "Let me in. Let me in. Let me in." Sophia grabbed the mouse, clicking desperately, but nothing responded. A soft chuckle echoed in her ears. Then the screen changed. It was her reflection. But something was wrong. Her reflection wasn't mimicking her movements. Instead, it lifted its arm, revealing the spreading mark. And then slowly it smiled. A deep, knowing smile. The voice whispered again, and this time it came from her own reflection. "You already did." Sophia shoved herself away from the desk, heart pounding. A coworker glanced at her with concern. "You okay?" he asked. She forced a nod. Yeah, just tired. The screen was normal again. No whispers. No twisted reflection. Maybe she was losing her mind. She took a deep breath and looked at her arm. The mark had spread past her elbow. And now, she could see something pushing against the skin, trying to break free. Sophia's breath shuddered as she pulled her sleeve down, covering the mark. It didn't help. She could still feel it, writhing beneath her skin, stretching like something alive. She pressed her palm over it, trying to steady herself. Keep it together. Just get through the day. But every second felt like an eternity. The whispers hadn't stopped. They curled around her mind, just out of reach, like a radio playing too softly to understand the words. Her co-workers moved around her, laughing, typing, talking. Normal life continued, unaware that something inside her was wrong. Then she felt it, a sudden cold creeping up her spine. She turned her head slowly. A man stood at the far end of the office. Tall, too thin, his suit hanging loosely on his frame. His face was blank, expressionless, except for his eyes. They were locked on her, unblinking. Sophia's fingers curled into her palms. She didn't know who he was, had never seen him before. He wasn't supposed to be there. Then he moved. Not walking, just shifting. 1 second he was by the copier, the next closer. She gasped, pushing her chair back with a scrape. The sound snapped the office into focus. People looked at her, confused. But when she glanced back toward the man, he was gone. Her breathing was too fast. Her head throbbed. Maybe she was imagining things. Sophia? She jerked at the voice. Her boss, Michael, frowned at her. You sure you're okay? You look pale. She nodded quickly. Yeah, just not feeling great. I think I need to step out for a minute. Michael hesitated, then sighed. All right, but take care of yourself. You've been off lately. She grabbed her coat and hurried to the elevator, avoiding everyone's eyes. The moment the doors shut behind her, the overhead light flickered. And then, she wasn't alone. A breath rasped against her ear. It's growing, Sophia. She spun, pressing herself against the wall. The elevator was empty, but the mark on her arm was burning. And when she looked down, she saw fingers pressing against the inside of her skin, trying to push through. Sophia clutched her arm, her nails digging into her skin as if she could hold whatever was inside her back. The sensation was unbearable, fingers pressing, shifting, stretching beneath the surface. The elevator jolted as it reached the ground floor, and she nearly stumbled as the doors slid open. The lobby was quiet, the usual morning bustle absent. Something felt wrong. She stepped forward cautiously, her breath shaky. The front desk was empty. No security guard. No receptionist. Just silence. Her footsteps echoed against the marble floors as she made her way toward the glass doors. Outside, the city was normal, people walking, cars moving, but the moment she reached for the handle, "Don't!" The whisper slithered through her mind, thick and oily. Her fingers trembled over the cold metal. They'll see it. They'll know. Sophia's breath hitched. Who? She whispered back, barely able to hear herself. Them. A shadow flickered in the glass reflection. Not hers. She turned sharply, but there was nothing. Just the empty lobby, stretching too far, the corners darker than they should be. The mark on her arm pulsed. The whispers grew louder, hissing and urgent. Leave. She didn't need to be told twice. Bolting through the doors, she stumbled onto the sidewalk, gasping for air. The cold wind hit her, snapping her back into reality. The world outside was moving as usual, oblivious to whatever was happening to her. But she felt it. She wasn't alone. She turned, scanning the crowd, and then she saw him, the same man from the office, standing on the opposite side of the street, unmoving, watching. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She took a step back, and the whisper returned, softer now. He knows Sophia. The man tilted his head, a slow, unnatural motion. Then he smiled. Not with his mouth, with his eyes. Something deep inside her screamed, and the mark burned. Sophia's body tensed as the man took a step forward. The traffic between them blurred into noise, her mind drowning in static. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt rooted to the ground. The whisper coiled around her thoughts. You can't run from this. Her breath hitched. She clutched her arm, feeling the mark pulse beneath her fingers. The man didn't move again. He only watched, his head still tilted, his eyes too wide, too knowing. And then, a bus passed between them. When it rolled away, he was gone. Sophia gasped, staggering backward. Her chest heaved as she spun, scanning the crowd, the sidewalks, the alleys. Nothing. He had vanished. I need to go home, she thought. But was home even safe? Her arm throbbed. The whispers slithered through her mind again. Home is where it all began. Sophia swallowed hard. She didn't want to believe it, but deep down she knew the truth. The mark, the voice, the man. It had started long before she woke up with it on her skin, and she needed to remember. Sophia stumbled into her apartment, slamming the door shut behind her. She twisted the lock with shaking fingers, her breath coming in short gasps. The silence inside felt too thick, too heavy. She pressed her back against the door, trying to steady herself. Think, think. The whispers had been with her for days now, slithering through her mind like a living thing. But today was different. The man, the way he looked at her, as if he knew something she didn't. Sophia's fingers dug into her arm, tracing the edges of the mark. It had darkened since the morning. The tendrils of shadow stretched further, curling toward her wrist. Why is it growing? Her heart pounded. She had to do something. She couldn't just sit here and wait for it to take her. Her eyes darted to the bathroom. Water. That was what she needed. She rushed to the sink, twisting the faucet with trembling hands. Cool water rushed over her skin as she scrubbed at the mark, harder and harder, until her skin burned. But the mark didn't fade. The whispers only grew louder. You can't wash me away. Sophia's breath hitched. She gritted her teeth, shaking her head. No, you're not real. The whisper laughed, soft and cruel. Aren't I? A sudden pain lanced through her arm. She gasped, staggering back. The mark pulsed, the shadows within it shifting. And then, for the first time, it moved. Her stomach twisted. The dark tendrils stretched under her skin, slithering up toward her shoulder. She could feel them crawling, sinking deeper into her flesh. Sophia clutched her arm, a choked sob escaping her lips. What is happening to me? A sharp knock echoed through the apartment. She froze. The knock came again, harder this time. And then, a voice. Low. Familiar. Sophia. Open the door. Her blood ran cold. It was the man from the street. Sophia backed away from the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. How did he find me? The apartment was on the 3rd floor. There was no way he could have followed her without her noticing. Another knock, louder this time. Sophia, I know you're in there. His voice was calm, steady, but there was something beneath it, something that made her skin crawl. The mark on her arm pulsed again. A deep, aching sensation spread through her veins, making her limbs feel heavy. She bit down on her lip, forcing herself to stay silent. I need to talk to you. I can help. Help. The word made her hesitate. No one had offered help before. Not when she tried to explain what was happening. Not when the doctors dismissed her, their faces unreadable as they scribbled notes. She took a shaky breath, staring at the door. Don't open it, the whisper coiled in her mind, cold and certain. But what choice did she have? Sophia's fingers hovered over the lock. She hesitated, then twisted it open. The door creaked as it swung inward. The man stood there, his face partially obscured by the dim hallway light. He was older than she had first thought, with streaks of gray in his hair and deep lines carved into his face. His eyes, dark and knowing, locked onto hers. It's worse than I thought, he murmured. Sophia's throat tightened. Who are you? She whispered. The man exhaled slowly, stepping inside. My name is Elias, he said. And if we don't act now, you won't be Sophia for much longer. Her stomach twisted. What do you mean? Elias didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small black book. This mark, it's not just a curse, he said. It's an opening, and something is trying to come through. The shadows on her arm writhed, as if in response. Sophia staggered back, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. How do you know all this? She asked. Elias met her gaze, his expression grim. Because, he said, I've seen it before. Sophia's hands clenched into fists. You've seen it before? She repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias nodded, stepping deeper into the apartment. His gaze flicked to the dim light overhead, to the locked windows, to the trembling fingers she tried to hide. You're fighting it, aren't you? He asked. Sophia swallowed hard. Every second. Elias sighed, flipping open the small black book. The pages were yellowed, worn with age, filled with strange symbols and frantic handwriting. This mark, he said, pointing at a sketch nearly identical to the shape growing on her skin. It's called the Shadow's Mark. It doesn't just whisper, it takes. Little by little, it feeds on your thoughts, your memories. It unravels you until you're nothing but an empty vessel. Sophia felt her legs go weak. She grabbed the back of the chair to steady herself. And then what? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Elias hesitated. Then it walks in your place. A shudder ran through her. The voice in her head, those cold, insidious whispers, grew louder as if it had been waiting for this moment. Liar, it hissed. He wants to take me away from you. He doesn't understand us. Sophia pressed her palm against the mark, her breath shuddering. How do I stop it? She asked. How do I make it go away? Elias turned the page. More frantic notes, desperate scribbles. Once the mark takes root, there's no way to remove it, he admitted. But there is a way to trap it. Sophia's head snapped up. Trap it? Elias glanced at her, his eyes unreadable. It won't be easy, he said. And if we fail, the thing inside you won't just take your body. It'll be stronger than before. The whisper coiled around her thoughts, sharper now. Kill him before he ruins everything. Sophia squeezed her eyes shut. Tell me what to do, she said. Elias let out a slow breath. We need to go back to where it started, he said. Back to the place where you got the mark. Her stomach dropped. The cabin, she whispered. Elias nodded. It's waiting for you. And deep inside her mind, the voice laughed. The drive to the cabin felt endless. The road stretched ahead in an unbroken path of darkness, the trees lining the sides like twisted sentinels watching their approach. The silence between Sophia and Elias was thick, filled only by the distant hum of the car's tires against the pavement. Every few minutes, Sophia felt a pulse of heat from the mark on her arm, as if it were growing restless. The whispering had changed. It no longer spoke in fragmented sentences. It was clearer now, stronger. You don't need him, it said. Turn around. Go home. Let me in. She clenched her jaw and gripped the steering wheel tighter. Sophia, Elias said. She flinched. What? He was watching her carefully. You're shaking. Sophia exhaled slowly and forced herself to loosen her grip. I'm fine. Elias didn't look convinced. It's getting stronger, isn't it? She hesitated. Lying felt pointless. Yes. Elias ran a hand through his hair. We need to be fast. Once we're inside, you have to fight whatever it does to you. Sophia's hands trembled on the wheel. And if I can't? Elias hesitated, then pulled a small, rusted knife from his coat pocket. Its blade was covered in symbols, etched deep into the metal. If it takes over completely, he said, I'll have to stop you. Sophia's stomach twisted. The voice inside her chuckled. Kill him first. She swallowed hard. Just tell me what to do. The cabin came into view, its dark shape looming at the end of the road. The windows were empty, hollow. No lights, no signs of life. But as Sophia stepped out of the car, the mark on her arm burned hot enough to make her gasp. "It's waiting for us," she whispered. Elias grabbed his bag. "Then let's not keep it waiting." They stepped forward into the darkness as the voice in her mind began to sing. The cabin smelled of dust and damp wood. The air was thick, stale, as if no one had stepped inside for years. Moonlight filtered through the cracks in the boarded windows, casting jagged shadows across the floor. Sophia's breath hitched as the mark pulsed violently, heat spreading up her arm like wildfire. The voice inside her was no longer whispering. It was speaking in full, clear sentences. "You're home now. Let me out." She stumbled, gripping the doorframe to steady herself. Elias was already moving, pulling out a bundle of old, yellowed papers from his bag. "We have to start now." He spread the papers across the wooden floor, revealing a complex diagram of symbols and lines. At the center was an empty space, large enough for someone to stand inside. Sophia swallowed hard. "What is this?" "A barrier," Elias said. "If you stand in the middle, it'll keep the spirit from fully taking over." She hesitated, staring at the space like it was a trap. "It's trying to trick you," Elias said. "Get inside." Her legs felt heavy, as if something unseen was resisting her movements. But she forced herself forward, stepping into the circle. The moment she did, the mark on her arm seared with white-hot pain. She gasped, clutching at her arm. The veins beneath her skin were turning black, twisting like roots spreading from the mark. The pain drove her to her knees. "Sophia!" Elias shouted. She barely heard him. The voice inside her was laughing now, its presence pressing against her mind like 1,000 sharp needles. "You think this will hold me?" it sneered. "You are mine." Her vision blurred. The room around her seemed to shift, bending and twisting. She was no longer in the cabin. She was somewhere else. A long, endless corridor stretched before her, its walls pulsing like a living thing. The air smelled of rot. At the far end of the corridor, something moved in the shadows. It was waiting, watching, waiting for her to step forward. "Come to me," the voice whispered. Sophia's body trembled. She wasn't in control anymore. The shadow was pulling her in. Elias saw Sophia's body stiffen, her eyes rolling back as she collapsed onto her knees inside the circle. The candlelight flickered violently, casting eerie shapes across the cabin walls. He had seen possession before, but never this fast, never this strong. "Stay with me, Sophia," he shouted, but she didn't respond. Her breathing was shallow, her body unmoving except for the slow, unnatural twitch of her fingers. The veins on her arm pulsed black, spreading beyond the mark like roots claiming soil. Elias knew he didn't have much time. He grabbed the knife from his bag, its silver blade catching the dim light. His hands shook, but he pressed the tip against his palm, drawing a thin line of blood. Blood binds the spirit. Blood commands the spirit. His voice wavered as he spoke the incantation, words that had been passed down through generations of those who had fought things like this. "By the wound I give, by the life I spill, I call thee forth and cast thee into the void." The moment his blood hit the wooden floor, the air in the room thickened, growing unbearably heavy. The temperature dropped so suddenly that his breath came out in visible puffs. Sophia let out a low, guttural sound. Not a scream, not a cry, something inhuman. Her body jerked, head snapping up, eyes wide, completely black. Elias stumbled back. "You cannot stop this," the voice said through her lips, but it wasn't her voice. It was layered, deep and distorted, echoing from a place far beyond the physical world. The candles flickered violently, their flames stretching unnaturally high before blowing out all at once. Darkness swallowed the cabin. A whisper slithered through the black. "Let me in, Elias." His stomach clenched. The ritual wasn't working fast enough. If he didn't find a way to sever the connection soon, Sophia would be lost. And then the thing inside her would come for him. Elias fumbled in the darkness, his fingers scrambling to relight the candles. His pulse pounded in his ears. The air around him felt thick, pressing against his chest like unseen hands. "Let me in, Elias." The voice slithered again, curling into his ears, sinking beneath his skin. He refused to listen. With a shaky breath, he struck a match, the tiny flame illuminating Sophia's face. Her mouth was twisted into a grin that did not belong to her. Her pupils were black voids, swallowing all light. The veins crawling up her arm pulsed like living things. "She is already mine," the thing whispered through her lips. "You cannot undo what has been done." Elias gritted his teeth. "I don't need to undo it," he said, grabbing the vial of salt from his bag. "I just need to break the bond." He poured a line of salt around Sophia's body, the grains glowing faintly as they hit the floor. The entity inside her hissed, her body convulsing violently. "No!" The walls trembled. The floorboards groaned beneath them. The very air quivered with rage. Sophia's head snapped back, a terrible, gurgling scream ripping from her throat. Elias ignored it. He pressed his bleeding palm against the mark on her arm, feeling the searing cold of it. "I cast thee out," he whispered, his voice steady. The mark burned against his touch. The black veins writhed, recoiling like worms drenched in salt. Sophia's body jerked. "And oh!" the entity howled. A force slammed into Elias, knocking him backward. He hit the floor hard, the air leaving his lungs in a sharp gasp. The candles blew out again. But this time, the darkness wasn't empty. Something moved in the shadows. Something vast. Something waiting. The ritual wasn't over. And Elias wasn't sure he had the strength to finish it. Elias pushed himself up, his body aching from the impact. He could hear Sophia gasping for air, her body trembling within the salt circle. But the presence in the darkness had not left. It lingered, watching, waiting. "You are weak," the voice rasped, no longer speaking through Sophia but from the blackness itself. "You cannot cast me out. She belongs to me." Elias gritted his teeth. The entity was powerful, but it was not invincible. He reached into his bag with shaking hands, pulling out a small silver blade. His grandfather had told him once, "Blood seals a deal, but it can also break one." "You made a mistake," Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You marked her, but she did not accept you." The shadow recoiled, shifting violently, its form writhing along the walls like living smoke. "She called to me." "No," Elias corrected. "You forced yourself onto her." He turned to Sophia, who lay panting within the circle, her eyes fluttering open. She was still there, still fighting. That was enough. "Sophia, listen to me," Elias said, crawling closer to the edge of the salt line. "I need you to reject it. You have to say the words." Her lips trembled. Her eyes filled with tears. I can't," she choked out. The darkness around them thickened, closing in like a vice. "You can," Elias urged. "Say it." Sophia swallowed hard, her voice shaking. "I reject you," she whispered. The entity roared. The walls trembled. The candles sparked to life on their own, flickering wildly. "Louder!" Elias shouted. Sophia squeezed her eyes shut, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I reject you," she screamed. The mark on her arm burned a deep crimson. The veins surged, then began to dissolve, flaking away like ash. The darkness let out a final, deafening screech before something unseen was yanked violently from the room. Then silence. Elias collapsed, his breath ragged. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight of the entity finally gone. Sophia sobbed, clutching her arm, the mark now nothing more than a faint scar. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Elias hesitated, staring at the blackened walls, the melted candles, the lingering cold in the air. "I don't know," he admitted, because deep in his gut he felt it. The shadow was not gone. It was only waiting. Sophia sat there trembling, her body weak, but her mind racing. The mark was gone, yet she could still feel something lingering beneath her skin, like an echo of the entity's touch. Elias was breathing heavily beside her, his hands gripping his knees as if trying to steady himself. "It's gone," Sophia whispered, though she didn't believe it. Elias looked at her, his eyes dark with exhaustion. "Maybe for now," he muttered. He reached into his bag and pulled out a flask of water, unscrewing the cap before handing it to her. "Drink," he said. Sophia took a shaky sip, her throat raw, her limbs still numb from the encounter. The room felt empty. Not in a peaceful way, but in a way that suggested something had left its mark behind. The air was still heavy, charged with an unseen force. "You felt it too, didn't you?" Sophia asked, gripping the flask. Elias didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for the melted candles, the burnt-out remains of their last line of defense. He crushed the wax in his palm, watching the dust fall between his fingers. "I think we drove it back," he finally said. "But I don't think it's gone. Not completely." Sophia shivered. "What does that mean?" Elias sighed, running a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. "It means it had a foothold here. And when something like that is forced out, it doesn't just disappear, it waits. It finds another way." Sophia's heart pounded. "But we sealed it out, right? The ritual, the salt, the rejection, it should have worked." Elias didn't answer. He stood up, brushing dust off his jeans. "We need to leave," he said. Sophia hesitated, looking around the room. The walls bore faint scorch marks, as if something had burned through reality itself. The shadows in the corners were deeper than they should have been. "Leave and go where?" she asked. Elias grabbed his bag, slinging it over his shoulder. "Somewhere it can't follow." Sophia's stomach twisted. "And where would that be?" Elias didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward the door, stepping over the broken candles, the smeared salt, the remnants of their desperate battle. Sophia took one last glance at the room before following him out. But as she crossed the threshold, she felt it, a whisper in the back of her mind. Soft, faint, familiar. "I'm still here." And the moment she stepped outside, she knew. The shadow had never left. It had just found a new home, within her. Sophia froze mid-step. The night air was cool against her skin, but inside, she felt a creeping warmth, something curling beneath her ribs, settling deep in her bones. Elias was already walking toward the car, but she couldn't move. The whisper had been so clear, as if spoken right into her ear. She swallowed hard, shaking her head. "No," she whispered. "No, we ended this." But the voice came again, softer this time, almost amused. "Did you?" Her breath hitched. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling for something, anything, out of place. But it was just her heartbeat, fast and uneven. "Sophia!" Elias called. She looked up, blinking at him in the dim light. He was standing by the car, watching her carefully. His posture was tense, his fingers gripping the strap of his bag. "Are you okay?" he asked. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to tell him that they had won, that she was fine, that they could finally leave this nightmare behind. But the words wouldn't come, because something was wrong, deeply, horribly wrong. Sophia forced a smile and walked toward him, her legs stiff, her body fighting against something she couldn't name. She reached the car and grabbed the handle, but the metal was ice cold beneath her fingers. A sharp pain shot up her arm, and she gasped, yanking her hand back. Elias frowned. "What is it?" Sophia looked down. The mark was back, not on her arm this time, but on her palm. A perfect, inky black spiral. It twisted and pulsed, the edges shifting like a living thing. Sophia's breath came in short, shallow bursts. "Elias!" She choked out. He stepped closer, then stopped. His face paled. "No," he muttered. "That's not possible. We..." Before he could finish, a sharp ringing filled Sophia's ears. Louder, louder, louder. She stumbled back, clutching her head. "Stop!" she cried. The whispering returned, flooding her mind, overlapping voices that she couldn't understand until she could. You opened the door. You let me in. You are mine now. Sophia dropped to her knees. The world spun, the pavement beneath her tilting like a broken carousel. Elias grabbed her shoulders, shaking her. Sophia, stay with me. She tried. She really did. But the last thing she saw was the mark spreading up her arm, wrapping around her like tendrils of ink. And then, the darkness swallowed her whole. Sophia's world was sinking. She felt weightless, drifting through an abyss where time stretched and twisted. The whispers wrapped around her, no longer outside her mind but inside it, speaking in voices she almost recognized. Let go. Give in. You were always meant to be ours. She tried to fight, tried to move, but she had no form here. No body. Only thought, only fear, only the mark that pulsed against her skin like a second heartbeat. Then light. Blinding, burning light. A hand gripped her wrist. Firm. Warm. Real. Sophia! Wake up! Elias. The darkness shattered. Sophia gasped as she was yanked back into her body. Cold air filled her lungs, sharp and painful. She was lying on the pavement, Elias kneeling over her, his face twisted in terror. Sophia, can you hear me? He asked. His hands were gripping her shoulders, shaking her slightly. Her vision swam. Her limbs felt sluggish, heavy. But the mark. Her eyes snapped to her arm. The black spiral had spread, creeping up her wrist like veins of ink. It was growing, changing, and it was still whispering. Not yet. Not yet. Sophia flinched. Elias, it's not over. He looked at her arm, his breath catching. We need to go. Now. She let him pull her up, though her legs wobbled beneath her. Every inch of her skin felt wrong, stretched too thin over something that wasn't entirely hers anymore. They got into the car. The doors slammed shut. Elias started the engine, his hands trembling as he gripped the wheel. I don't understand, he muttered. We ended it. We did everything the ritual said. Sophia's voice was hollow. Maybe it was never about ending it. Elias glanced at her, his knuckles white on the wheel. What do you mean? She lifted her palm. The mark was still shifting, moving like liquid shadow. I think. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. I think we let it in. The car lurched forward as Elias pressed the gas, the road stretching ahead, endless and dark. But deep inside, Sophia knew. No matter how far they drove, no matter how fast they ran, it was already too late. The night pressed in around them as the car sped down the empty road. The headlights barely cut through the darkness, and the trees on either side seemed to close in like grasping hands. Sophia stared at the mark on her arm, watching it shift and pulse like a living thing. The whispers were quieter now, but they hadn't stopped. They never truly stopped. Elias' grip tightened on the wheel. We have to find another way. There has to be something we missed. Sophia's voice was distant. What if we didn't miss anything? Elias' jaw clenched. Don't say that. Elias, think about it. We followed every step. We burned the sigil, we said the words, we even bled for it. And yet, she lifted her arm, showing him the mark that now curled past her elbow. It didn't leave. It changed. Elias stole a glance at it, his face pale in the dim light. Then we find another ritual. Another way. There has to be something. Sophia looked out the window. The trees blurred past. She felt the weight of the mark pressing deeper into her skin, as though it wasn't just growing, it was spreading. Elias, stop the car, she whispered. He shook his head. No, we need to. Elias, stop. Something in her tone cut through his panic. He slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car skidded to a stop on the side of the road. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Only the engine hummed, vibrating through their bones. Then Sophia turned to him, her voice quiet. I don't think it's just a mark anymore. I think it's inside me. Elias stared at her, his breath shallow. We can fix this, he said. but there was no conviction in his voice. Sophia let out a shaky breath. "No, Elias. We can't." A silence stretched between them. Then the radio crackled. A voice, low, distorted, whispered through the speakers. "We are still here." Elias' hand shot to the radio dial, twisting it frantically. Static hissed, warping in and out like a breath held too long. "What the hell?" he started, but Sophia wasn't listening. She clutched her arm, her nails digging into the skin around the mark. It was moving, slithering, expanding. The black tendrils stretched further up, curling toward her shoulder. And then, pain. Sophia gasped, arching forward as a burning sensation tore through her veins. It wasn't just skin deep anymore. It was inside, spreading like ink in water. "Sophia!" Elias grabbed her shoulders, shaking her, his voice thick with panic. "Stay with me. Hey, look at me." She barely heard him over the sound, the low, wet murmurs rising from the mark itself. The whispers were no longer words. They were voices, tangled together in a seething, hungry mass. Her lips parted, her breath hitched, and then she spoke, but it wasn't her voice. "We have waited long enough." Elias recoiled. His grip loosened. "Sophia?" Her head snapped toward him, too fast, too sharp. Her eyes, once warm and familiar, were now pitch black. "Empty. She is not here anymore," the voice said through her lips. Elias' pulse pounded. He scrambled backward in his seat. No, this couldn't be happening. "Give her back," he shouted. A slow smile spread across Sophia's face, but it was wrong. Too wide, too knowing. "She belongs to us now." Elias' breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. He couldn't think, couldn't move. Then, Sophia's body jerked violently. Her back arched, and she let out a raw, guttural scream. The sound of tearing flesh filled the car as the black veins beneath her skin ripped open, spilling darkness into the air. And then, silence. Her body slumped forward, motionless. Elias' shaking hands reached for her. "Sophia!" Her head lifted, slowly, and she smiled. Elias' breath caught in his throat. That smile, it wasn't hers. It was stretched too far, lips curling unnaturally at the edges, as if something else was wearing her face like an ill-fitting mask. "Sophia!" he whispered, his voice barely more than air. She blinked, tilting her head in an odd, mechanical way. The mark on her arm had spread completely, thick veins of black twisting up her throat, vanishing beneath her jaw. And then she laughed. Not a chuckle, not a giggle, a deep, guttural sound, rattling in her throat like broken glass. It echoed inside the car, pressing against Elias' ears, making his head pound. "She is gone," the voice rasped through her lips. "And soon so will you." Elias scrambled for the door handle, fingers fumbling in his panic. He shoved the door open and tumbled out onto the road, his breath ragged. The night air was thick, heavy, pressing down on him like wet cement. "Help!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Somebody help!" The trees swallowed his cries. A clicking sound came from behind him. Slow, rhythmic. He turned. Sophia, or whatever was inside her, was stepping out of the car. Her body moved stiffly, unnaturally, like a puppet on tangled strings. Her head twitched to the side, her blackened eyes locked onto him. "There is no help," she murmured. "There is only us." Elias took a step back, then another. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. Then, she lunged, faster than anything human should move. Elias barely had time to react before she crashed into him, sending him sprawling onto the pavement. His head slammed against the ground, stars bursting behind his eyes. Her fingers wrapped around his throat, ice cold, pressing down. "Hard. Let me show you," she whispered. And then, darkness. Not just the absence of light. It was alive, writhing, pulling him under like an ocean tide. His vision blurred. His breath faltered. And he fell. The darkness didn't end. It wasn't the quiet, empty void of sleep. It was thick, dense, and suffocating, wrapping around Elias' mind, his body. His heart pounded in his chest, but there was no air to take in. It was as if the entire world had vanished, leaving only this oppressive weight that smothered him. He tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed before it even reached his throat. His limbs felt heavy, like they were sinking into something viscous, something that wouldn't let go. And in that darkness, in that unbearable silence, he heard it. A whisper. Not Sophia's voice, but something worse. Something darker, deeper. She is gone. The whisper came from all around him, echoing in the black void. Elias' blood ran cold. Gone. What did that mean? No, he tried to say, but his voice was a mere breath. His mind was a haze, his thoughts scattering like leaves in the wind. The whispering grew louder, clearer. The words twisted together like a knot, tightening around his thoughts. He tried to pull away, but the more he struggled, the more the darkness seemed to consume him. It is too late. The voice came again, and then he felt it, a presence, something cold and sharp, like an ice-cold hand dragging down his spine. It pressed against him, crushing the air from his lungs. He couldn't breathe. His chest tightened. His limbs ached as if they were being twisted, forced into unnatural positions. Stop. The voice hissed, and Elias' heart skipped a beat. He tried to fight, tried to tear himself free, but it was useless. The darkness was in him now, sinking deep into his mind, into his very soul. It was everywhere. He reached out, desperate, grasping for something, anything. His fingers brushed against something soft. Eyes. His hands found her face, her skin cold and clammy under his touch. Sophia. But she was different. Her face was a mask, distorted, hollow, like a thing no longer human. Her eyes were wide open, empty, and staring at him with an unseeing gaze. Her lips parted, but no words came out, just that horrible, rasping laughter. No, Elias whispered, pulling away from her, his heart racing. His hands trembled as he wiped at his face, the terror mounting. This wasn't her. Then suddenly he was falling again, falling through the abyss, tumbling endlessly, unable to catch his breath, unable to stop the pull of gravity. But then, a light, a faint glow, so soft it was almost impossible to see, but it was there, flickering like the dying embers of a fire. He reached toward it, drawn to it with a force he couldn't explain. The darkness around him tried to pull him back, but the light was too bright, too strong. It beckoned him, and he followed. No more. The voice came again, louder now, more forceful. You cannot escape. The light flickered again, and Elias reached for it with all his strength. This time, the pull was stronger than the darkness, and he felt himself moving toward the light, through the darkness, until everything stopped. There was silence. Elias' heart hammered in his chest as he blinked, trying to make sense of the world around him. He was back. He was lying on the cold ground, the night air sharp against his skin. The moon above was full, casting its pale light over everything. His mind was foggy, and his body felt strange, as if he had just awoken from a dream, a nightmare. And then he saw it, the mark on his arm. The mark had spread even further, wrapping around his entire arm now, twisted into grotesque patterns that seemed to pulse with an unnatural life. But something had changed. It was still there, but now it was silent. No more whispers, no more voice. It was as if something had shifted. But for how long? Elias slowly sat up, his head spinning. He had to move, had to find Sophia. He couldn't stay here, not like this. But as he stood, his eyes caught something in the distance. A figure, a dark shape, standing in the shadows of the trees. Watching him. It was Sophia, or whatever was left of her. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there, a silhouette against the moonlight. Elias' stomach churned. He felt the cold dread settle deep inside him. He didn't want to face it again, but he knew deep down that he had no choice. Sophia, or the thing wearing her face wasn't done. And the curse wasn't over. It had only just begun. Elias stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure in the shadows remained motionless, its form indistinguishable in the dim moonlight. It didn't approach him. It didn't speak. But he could feel its presence, like a cold wind brushing against his skin, an oppressive weight in the air. His mind raced. Was it really Sophia? No, it couldn't be. He had seen her face, twisted and distorted by whatever cursed force had taken hold of her. This wasn't her. But then what was it? What had become of her? Sophia, he whispered, his voice trembling. The word seemed to hang in the air, swallowed by the silence. He took a cautious step forward, his feet dragging as if the very ground beneath him was pulling him back. The figure in the shadows didn't move. It didn't respond. Elias swallowed, his throat dry as sand. He took another step, closer this time. His breath quickened, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Suddenly the figure shifted. It was a barely noticeable movement, but Elias felt it like a shock to his system. It tilted its head, just slightly, as though it was considering him. And then, with the faintest of sounds, like the rustle of leaves, a whisper rose from the figure's lips. "Come closer." Elias froze, the hair on his arms prickling. The voice was soft, almost sweet, but it held an edge to it, a malicious undertone that sent a chill through him. His mind screamed for him to turn and run, but his feet wouldn't move. The voice came again, more insistent this time. "Come closer, or she will suffer." He didn't know what it meant. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the twisted words. Was this some sort of threat? Was it still trying to manipulate him, like it had done to Sophia? A part of him, some small, defiant part, wanted to scream, to demand what it wanted, but another part of him was paralyzed with fear. His legs felt heavy, and the darkness around him seemed to stretch, swallowing everything in its wake. He wanted to fight it, but how could he? It was the curse, the thing that had taken Sophia. It was too powerful. "Stop," Elias muttered under his breath, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to the figure or to himself. He stepped back, his hand shaking at his side. "Just leave us alone." The figure didn't react. Instead, the shadowy outline began to shift, swirling like smoke in the air. The moonlight flickered, casting an eerie glow on the scene, and for a brief moment, Elias thought he saw something else, a pair of glowing eyes, staring directly at him from the center of the darkness. "It's not over," the voice whispered again, but this time, it wasn't coming from the figure. It was in his mind, deep and invasive, like a memory he hadn't realized he'd forgotten. "The curse lives in you now. It will never let go." A sickening wave of dread washed over Elias. The mark on his arm burned again, more intense this time, as though it was feeding off his fear, growing stronger with every passing second. The whispering in his mind was relentless, like 1,000 voices speaking in unison, urging him to surrender, urging him to give in. He tried to shake it off, but the voice wouldn't stop. "You are the key." He stumbled back, his heart racing. He wanted to escape, to run, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the shadow in the distance. "The mark will claim you. You will become like her." The words were a knife in his chest, and for a moment, he felt a sense of hopelessness seep into his bones. Could he really break free from this curse? Could he save Sophia, or was he doomed to become just another puppet in whatever twisted game this thing was playing? Elias felt his resolve beginning to waver, the darkness pulling at his thoughts. He wasn't sure how much longer he could fight. The mark on his arm itched, burned, as if it was demanding something from him. "Come to me," the voice whispered once more, now smooth and sweet, like a lure. "Come to me, and I will give you everything you desire." He closed his eyes, trying to block it out, trying to shut out the voice, the darkness. But it was impossible. Every part of him was overwhelmed by the weight of it. He was trapped, a prisoner in his own body. But then there was something else. A spark, a small flicker of light in the distance. It wasn't much, but it was enough to draw his attention. He wasn't alone. There was someone else, something else, out there. "Sophia!" Elias shouted, his voice hoarse, desperate. He didn't care anymore. He had to find her, had to stop this madness before it consumed everything. The figure in the shadows moved again, but this time it stepped into the moonlight. Sophia, her face, pale and hollow, stared back at him, her eyes dark, as though the life had been drained from her. Her lips moved, but the words she spoke were barely a whisper. "You can't save me." The words hung in the air like poison, and Elias took a step forward, despite the warnings that screamed inside his head. "Sophia, please," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "We can fix this. I can fix this." But her eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, remained unblinking, unfeeling. "You are the curse now, Elias. There is no escape." Elias's breath caught in his throat. He could hardly process the words, the overwhelming feeling of helplessness creeping into every corner of his mind. Sophia was lost. She was right. There was no saving her now. But he wouldn't accept it. Not like this. Not after everything. "Please," he repeated, his voice trembling as he reached out toward her. "I won't let it take you. We can fight this. We can still fight it." But as his hand hovered in the air, something inside him twisted, a cold sensation seeping into his skin. His arm burned, the mark pulsating with a life of its own. The pain was unbearable now, a searing heat that radiated up his entire arm, shooting into his chest. He could feel the curse wrapping around his heart, squeezing it tighter with every heartbeat. Sophia's eyes never wavered, and her lips barely parted as she spoke again. "You're too late, Elias. The mark is in you now. You can't run from it. You'll become like me, like all of us." The words cut deeper than any blade could. His legs trembled as the burning in his arm worsened. The whispers were louder now, not just in his mind, but in the air around him, surrounding him. The voice had become countless voices, murmuring over one another, and he couldn't tell where one ended and another began. The curse was alive inside him, feeding on his desperation, his fear. "It's too late. There's no escape. You'll be just like me." Sophia's face was a twisted mask of sorrow and resignation. Her voice, once sweet and familiar, now sounded hollow and distant, as if it came from somewhere far, far away. The woman he had loved, the woman who had been by his side through everything, was gone, replaced by something unrecognizable. A vessel for the curse, just like him. "No," Elias whispered, shaking his head violently. He couldn't believe it. He wouldn't believe it. But as he looked at her, really looked at her, he saw the truth. Her body was pale, her features gaunt, her eyes lifeless. She was a shadow of the woman she once was, and the more he looked, the more he saw the mark on her arm, the same one that now seared into his own skin. The curse had claimed her. It was inescapable. "You're already slipping, Elias," the voice hissed from behind him, its tone laced with malevolent satisfaction. "You're already one of us." Elias stumbled back, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. His chest tightened, and his breath came in short, frantic gasps. No, he refused to give in. He couldn't. The world around him shifted. The darkness that had been creeping at the edges of his vision began to bleed into his surroundings. The forest seemed to grow darker, the trees twisted and gnarly, stretching upward like fingers of something ancient and hungry. The ground beneath his feet began to shift, becoming soft and yielding, as if the earth itself was turning against him. "You're trapped, Elias." The words echoed in his mind, louder and more forceful now. He staggered backward, desperate to get away, but there was nowhere to go. His heart hammered in his chest, the mark on his arm burning with such intensity that it felt like his skin might burst open. Elias's mind screamed for him to wake up, to break free from this nightmare, but the whispers kept coming. The curses, the threats, the promises of damnation. His thoughts were drowning in them, each one more insistent than the last. "You belong to me now." His vision blurred, and he stumbled, falling to his knees. The shadows seemed to be pulling him, dragging him downward, as if the earth itself was trying to swallow him whole. "Sophia!" Elias cried out again, his voice breaking. He reached for her, his hand trembling. She was still there, still staring at him with those hollow eyes, but she didn't move. She couldn't. She was lost. But then, as his hand got closer to her, something strange happened. A flicker of light appeared in the distance, small and bright, like the flicker of a match in the darkness. Elias's heart skipped a beat. Was it hope? Was it a way out? "Come to me." The voice came again, but this time it wasn't from Sophia. It wasn't from the shadows or the curse. It was from somewhere else, somewhere far away, yet so close. The light was growing, expanding, pulsing like a heartbeat. Elias felt a surge of desperation. If he could just reach it, if he could just find a way to break free, maybe there was still time. Maybe there was still hope for him. "Come to me, Elias." The voice called again, gentle yet urgent. It was a voice he knew, a voice that had once been warm and comforting, but it had been lost, buried beneath layers of darkness and fear. Elias rose to his feet, his body shaking with the effort. He pushed forward, his steps unsteady, but each one bringing him closer to the light. It was his only chance, his only way out. The shadowy figure of Sophia began to fade into the background as the light grew brighter, more intense, until it engulfed him entirely. He could feel the darkness retreating, could feel it slipping from his skin like a heavy cloak being lifted. His arm, the mark, it burned with an intensity that nearly made him scream, but the light was soothing now, cool against the heat. "Please," Elias whispered as the light wrapped around him. "Please let this be the way out. Let me break free." And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the voice grew quiet. The whispers, the shadows, the curse, it all seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting. "You are the key," the voice whispered, no longer malicious but almost resigned. Elias closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. If this was the end of it, if this was the only way to break free, then he would do it. He had no other choice. Elias's breath slowed as the light around him pulsed, enveloping him in a cocoon of warmth. His mind felt clearer, the fog of dread that had clouded his thoughts lifting. He clutched at his chest, where the mark on his arm throbbed painfully. The glow had not completely erased the darkness, but it was enough to make him feel something like hope again. He stood tall, his body aching but resilient. The light seemed to guide him, urging him forward, each step taking him closer to freedom. The shadows that had once consumed everything around him began to recede, drawing back into the corners of the world, leaving behind only silence. The oppressive weight of the curse lightened with every breath he took, and then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the light began to fade. It was no longer a beacon. It became a faint shimmer in the distance, as if pulling away from him. His heart thudded in his chest. No, he wasn't ready. He wasn't ready to face the darkness again. He reached out, desperate, but the light pulled back farther, slipping just out of his reach. His feet stumbled, his legs giving way beneath him as the ground seemed to tremble. He could feel the whispers stirring again, louder now, a distant yet insistent hum in his mind. "You cannot escape. You belong to me." The voice echoed once more, but this time it was different. There was a strange sorrow in it, as if it knew that Elias was slipping away, that he was close to breaking free. Elias gritted his teeth, determination flooding his veins. "No, I won't let you win. I won't be your vessel." His arm burned as he pressed his hand to it, trying to push the mark back. It was as if the curse was tightening its grip around him once more. He could feel the malevolent force pulling at him, trying to reel him back in, to claim him as it had claimed Sophia. But he fought. He fought with everything he had. He took another step forward, the ground beneath him shaking as the darkness grew more restless. The trees around him seemed to bend and twist, their branches creaking like bones. The air grew thick, and the world felt like it was closing in on him. He could hear it now, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him, the crunch of leaves and branches underfoot. He turned, his pulse quickening. Was it her? Was it Sophia? Or was it something else, something darker? You cannot run from me, Elias. The voice spoke again, this time sharper, more commanding. The air grew colder, the shadows crawling up the trees, wrapping around them like chains. The forest felt alive, breathing, pulsating with an ancient energy that suffocated everything it touched. The footsteps drew closer, slow and deliberate. Elias's heart raced. He turned back to the light, but it was no longer there. The hope, the warmth, was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of doom. He was alone. The curse was closing in on him, suffocating him with every passing second. He could feel its presence behind him, creeping closer. He could almost hear it breathing, its every movement a promise of death, of corruption. It was the end. Elias collapsed to his knees, his body shaking. The mark on his arm blazed with a fire that seemed to burn straight through his soul. He gasped for air, unable to breathe, the weight of it all pressing down on him. You are mine now. The voice was so close now, its cold breath brushing against the back of his neck. Elias's eyes widened in terror. He couldn't escape. He couldn't outrun it. The mark was part of him. The curse was inside him. He reached out, fingers trembling, and in the darkness before him, a shape appeared. It was faint at first, but it grew clearer, more defined. It was Sophia, her figure distorted and flickering like a reflection in a broken mirror. She was reaching for him, her hand outstretched. "Help me," she whispered, her voice a haunting echo of what it once was. "Please, Elias, help me." But Elias could see the truth. It wasn't her. Not really. It was the curse, using her image, drawing him back into the void. He tried to pull away, but his body wouldn't move. His limbs were heavy, numb from the weight of the curse. The whispers were louder now, all around him, crawling beneath his skin, filling his head with thoughts of terror and despair. "You are nothing. You are mine." The voice was triumphant now, rising above the others, its power surging through him like a river of fire. It was too much, too overwhelming. But in that moment, as he lay on the ground, gasping for breath, he remembered the flicker of light, the warmth that had surrounded him, the voice that had whispered to him, urging him to come closer. Could it still be there? Could he find his way back to it? "You are lost," the voice said, louder now, mocking him. "There is no light for you, only darkness." But Elias refused to give in. The pain in his arm was unbearable, but he still fought. He focused on the memories of the light, the hope that had been so strong within him. The whisper of comfort, the gentle pull that had drawn him forward. With all the strength he had left, Elias lifted his arm, his hand trembling as he reached toward the fading memory of the light. He focused on it, on the warmth, on the possibility of escape. "Please," he whispered, his voice weak. "I need to get out. I can't be like this." The forest seemed to pause, the darkness surrounding him thickening, as if waiting for his next move. The whispers quieted, giving him a moment of clarity, a moment to choose. Elias's heart pounded in his chest, and his mind raced as the darkness closed in. The whispering voices, now frantic, were a constant in his ears, clawing at his thoughts. It was almost as if the curse itself was anticipating his failure, the weight of it pressing down on him with crushing inevitability. But Elias had made his choice. He knew what he had to do, even if it seemed impossible. The memory of the light, the warmth that had wrapped around him moments before, was still there, a faint glow within the depths of his mind. He focused on it, pulling all the strength he could muster from the deepest part of himself. He reached out again, his fingers trembling as they cut through the heavy air. His body screamed in protest, the mark on his arm burning, but he didn't stop. He had to reach the light. The whispers had become a cacophony of rage, but he drowned them out, focusing solely on the hope that still flickered within him. "I can't be like this," he repeated under his breath, the words almost a prayer. "I won't let you win." As if in response, the darkness recoiled, retreating for a brief moment. The mark on his arm pulsed with a sickening throb, but Elias didn't relent. He pushed his body to its limits, straining against the curse that had been chaining him for so long. And then, in a moment of clarity, the light returned. It wasn't as blinding as before, but it was enough. The warmth surrounded him once more, pulling him into its embrace. He could feel the whispers fading, the heavy weight of the curse lifting, and the oppressive darkness receding. He stumbled to his feet, his body weak and unsteady, but his mind clearer than it had been in weeks. The mark on his arm had stopped its pulsing, its glow dimming to nothing. The pain was gone. The forest around him, once alive with malevolent energy, now stood still. The trees, their twisted shapes no longer threatening, stood like silent sentinels, their branches still. The air, once thick and suffocating, felt lighter now, free of the curse's grasp. Elias took a deep breath, his lungs filling with air that felt pure for the first time in what felt like an eternity. He felt the cool breeze against his skin, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to relax. The curse was broken. "It's over," Elias whispered to himself, the words barely audible as he stood there, alone in the quiet forest. The weight had lifted, but he couldn't help but feel the absence of the darkness like an ache in his soul. He glanced down at his arm, where the mark had once been. There was nothing now, no sign of the curse, no trace of the malevolent spirit that had tormented him. He was free, but even as he stood there, in the stillness of the forest, Elias knew that the darkness was never truly gone. It lingered like a shadow on the edge of his mind, waiting for a moment of weakness, waiting for the next soul to be marked. For now he was safe, but the curse had always been there, lurking just beneath the surface. Elias turned, taking one last look at the place that had nearly destroyed him, and began to walk away, the whispers of the curse fading into nothingness. He was free, for now. And that's the end of tonight's stories. Keep listening to the sound of rain and fall into a deep, peaceful sleep.